Hi, hello, and welcome to the news. I'm your news mommy, Katie Stoll. Wait, news aunt? It's weird either way. Anyway, Cody's fine. He's alive for now. And here's some more news. Babies. Oh, look at them. They're just like little adults, except small, new. Their skulls are soft and squishy, and it's socially acceptable for them to poop themselves. Not fair, in my opinion. But hey, here's a question many people in their reproductive years are struggling with. Should you have one of these cute, tiny jerks? It's kind of a loaded question, filled with lots of sub-questions and no clear answers. And as someone in their late 30s, it's something I feel like I get asked about almost every week. Everyone I know who is staring down the barrel of a dusty womb is feeling the pressure to make up their damn minds and decide if we want to close up shop or welcome in a new tenant. So let's dig into that. Are you expected to have a child? Are you obligated to have a child for the good of society? Or are you obligated not to have a child, also for the good of society? We're often given conflicting messages and guilt over either needing to have children for the public good or needing to not have children for the public good. That alone can get pretty confusing. And we're not even done asking questions yet. There's also the financial aspect to your decision. Can you afford to have a child? But, counterpoint, in your old age, can you afford not to have a child taking care of you? You might want to delay the question until you feel financially stable and or you found a reliable partner, but whoopsie, then it might be too late. And of course, your health should be considered. Is it safe for you to have children? Would it put your health at risk? Are these medical decisions even up to you and your doctor, or rather up to a shadowy council of non-doctor men and to a lesser extent ladies who wear ceremonial robes and carry special hammers that they use to crack open walnuts to feed upon the delicious flesh within? Why don't we all get these hammers? Wow, boy, that's a lot of questions. So let's just take a deep breath and delve into this extremely personal topic in a calm, non-judgmental way with limited references to how unfair it is that adults can't just poop their pants. I mean, honestly, it would just save so much time. Also, I kind of want a soft school. I'm always getting this thing stuck in things. Should you have a baby? Hey there, ladies and womb havers. Are you a washed-up husk if you don't have babies? After all, us be-uterus peoples are constantly being told that we gotta get some baby batter up in these easy-bake ovens before our womb shrivels. There are some real concerns about running out of time to have children, such as fertility, increased chance of miscarriage, and increased risk of pregnancy complications. If you want fertility treatment or IVF or egg freezing, it's quite costly. Egg freezing is over $7,000, and IVF is in the tens of thousands of dollars, a cost that is, quite simply, absurd, especially when you consider that the best time to do an effective egg retrieval is during our 20s, when most people can't afford their college loans, let alone something elective. Also, the average age of first-time mothers in the US has increased over time. Also, when most people can't afford their college loans, let alone something elective. Also, the average age of first-time mothers in the US has increased over time from 21 in 1972 to 26 in 2016. In dense cities, the average age is skewed even later to the early 30s. Much of this can be explained by things like access to birth control, abortion, careers for women, but also less financial stability, meaning people need to wait longer to be able to support a child. In fact, when the New York Times polled 1,800 people about why they weren't having kids, the number one answer was that childcare was too expensive. Mind you, answer number two was that they simply wanted to spend more effort and money on the child they did have. So it's not that people aren't having children at all, but rather having fewer kids. The average family size, as in adults and children in a single household, has gone from 4 in 1960 to 3 today, which is all to say that kids are still a thing that people want, but are simply limiting due to various factors. But despite these factors, women are still cautioned that time's a ticking, and there is an endless bombardment of think pieces about whether you should or shouldn't have kids. One of the main questions, of course, is if having children will make you happy. Or sad? Or some other emotion that happens when you clean baby poop from under your fingernails. Oh, too bad we can't just hook them up to the Hello Tushy bidet, huh? So let's start there. Will having children make you happy? Unfortunately, the answer to that might depend on where you live. There are some studies that show having children can make people less happy, but there are also studies that show having children increases people's happiness, especially fathers. Here's a Princeton economics study that found that kids will both give you more joy and more stress than if you don't have kids. So apparently, surprise, parenthood's complicated. But complicating things even further is that the happiness of parents seems significantly impacted by which country they live in and the social policies of those countries. In one study comparing 22 wealthy countries, parents are happier in countries that provide more paid parental leave and childcare subsidies. And the happiness between parents and non-parents becomes higher and relatively equal with increases in paid parental leave and paid sick and vacation leave and more work flexibility. Giving more to parents also didn't take away from the happiness of non-parents, but actually increased it if the country had more worker-friendly policies. According to this study, the United States has the largest happiness gap in terms of parenthood, meaning that it was the country with the most miserable parents compared to non-parents. In fact, the average parent in the US is less happy than the average non-parent. Meanwhile, the study found that in countries other than the US, such as Norway, Hungary, Portugal, Finland, Sweden, Spain, most parents were actually happier than non-parents. The study's lead author, Jennifer Glass, explained this by saying, "Unlike its economically developed counterparts, the US has done little to offset the costs of raising children and ameliorate the incompatibility between employment and childcare." Seems like an America problem. Like we're doing something wrong that other countries aren't? Is it the spray cheese? Who can say? But happiness isn't the only factor in the decision to have kids. People might genuinely want kids, or they might do it because it's the next milestone they want to hit, or simply because they think kids are cute, or to continue their legacy, or I don't know. Maybe they need like an extra organ or something. Of course, there's also the argument that you should have kids because no one else will look after you when you get old. According to one survey, 55% of parents expect their kids to support them in their elder years. It's a grimly practical reason, but it is a valid reason. After all, if you're not super wealthy, you may worry that you won't be taken care of as you age. I sure do. Think about it all the time. While it's true that you shouldn't have children just to make sure someone's there to take care of you when you're old, after all, that's a lot of pressure to put on a theoretical child who would theoretically have a life of their own at that point, it's also true that we live in a society that does not guarantee quality elder care. 2/3 of elders in US nursing homes rely on Medicaid to pay for their stay. This means that their Social Security, pension, and any remaining income goes towards paying for the care facility. And then they're left with a small stipend as low as $30 a month to pay for anything not provided by the nursing home. Having personal autonomy is incredibly important for the physical and mental health of older adults. So not having the dignity to be able to buy decent clothes for yourself and rely on hospital gowns, or not even being able to buy a pair of shoes, is a humiliating and unnecessarily cruel treatment of our elders. Pretty fucked up and unhealthy for people to feel pressured to have kids because they're terrified of ending up languishing in a nursing home. Seems like another America problem. Damn you, cheese. Maybe we should instead, as a country, make sure that our elderly are taken care of in their old age with, like, I don't know, tax dollars or something. Or I guess we could just use that money on a few more F-22 Raptor jets at $140 million a pop. After all, Raptors are millions of years older than our oldest old. They should be first in line for money. Ooh, or we could kill two birds with one stone and have our senior citizens fly the F-22 Raptor jets. Hey, did I just solve a problem? I'm gonna go ahead and assume I did. Ultimately, what these studies and variables are actually saying is that having kids isn't an automatic way to make you happy or sad. nor will it be an automatic success or failure. Sorry, really wish I could have just told you a solid answer, but that would have defeated the purpose of the video, because the answer depends on who you are and what your life and environment is. Having an environment that makes it easier to have kids will obviously make people happier on average, but it's still not guaranteed. It is subjective and personal. There's a logical and emotional component to this decision, and it's not the same process for everyone. And it's always been like that. In the past, being childless was seen as a moral failing, and while that's still often the case today, we're now getting to the flip side, where it's seen as morally questionable to bring a child into this world. Going back to that New York Times poll, 36% of respondents said they aren't having more children due to domestic politics. 33% noted climate change as well, and I think these concerns have created a certain false dichotomy over the years. The idea is that there are some people overthinking their decision to have kids versus other people who aren't thinking about it hard enough. The movie Idiocracy, of course, is based completely on this idea, warning of a future where only, quote, stupid people are willing to mass produce while so-called smart people overthink it. Just a teeny bit of eugenics in that film. Then there's, of course, generational and religious pressures. Boomers who procreated without a second thought are now wondering why younger generations aren't doing the same. This is all to say that having kids has now become extremely political in the US. And I don't mean political in the sense of, hey, we should vote for more money for schools, but in terms of a perceived culture war between kid-hating leftists and family-loving conservatives. Apparently the left doesn't want to have any kids, and the right wants to have 20 kids per family. And that is strange and feels made up. And it's doing some weird stuff to our brains. Talking about babies as a political topic seems to remove some fundamental aspects from the conversation. For example, a lot of vocal conservatives seem to really like the idea of having babies, but don't actually seem to like children themselves. Dennis Prager, founder of Prager University, which is not accredited or a university or should be taken seriously unless you live in Florida and I think also Texas and Oklahoma, I guess. Oof. Well, he writes screeds complaining that Americans are having so few children that the fertility rate fell to a record low 62.9 births per 1,000 women in 2013, which is presumably bad? But then he also says stuff like this.
What has any fifth grader done to have made the world better because he or she is in it? Boy, again, as I pointed out, it's the opposite of the way many of us were raised. If my father had said to me, you know, Dennis, the world is better because you are in it, I would have believed to have made the world better.
He wrote 2013.
Is in it. They're done to have made the world better because he or she is in it. Boy, again, as I pointed out, it's the opposite of the way many of us were raised. If my father had said to me, you know, Dennis, the world is better because you are in it, I would have believed that even though he was never drunk, that he was actually drunk.
Wow, Dennis, that sounds kind of sad. Like maybe your father wasn't a great dad, should have made you feel loved and special, at least to him. Maybe fifth graders do make the world a better place, you know, for their parents and the people who love them. It's a weird position to take, that you need to have children for the good of society, but also society does not and should not give a shit about your child, and that your child does not improve the world in any way. Unless, of course, we indoctrinate them young and send those adorable little leeches to work by loosening child labor laws and turning a blind eye when migrant children are working dangerous jobs. It's almost like they see kids as a commodity and ideological prey rather than actual humans. But maybe if you want to have kids because you want them as a resource or a status symbol but don't actually like kids, I don't know, maybe you shouldn't have kids. Seems that liking kids should be a factor in your decision. And on the flip side, maybe it's bad to not have kids simply because you're paralyzed about what the future will hold. I understand the dread of bringing a kid into a scorched wasteland, and while that's a valid concern in that the wasteland is a definite possibility, valid concerns have never stopped us before, what with all the nukes and the Black Plague. The world has always been bad and scary in one way or another, and raising a child has always come with great risk. That's why we're still here, because we still made babies despite the many dangers in the world. Not so long ago, your adorable baby boy might get carried off by a velociraptor, and there would be nothing that you could do about it. Do not fact check that, please. Point is that climate change aside, maybe politics shouldn't factor much into this specific decision at all. But unfortunately, this is a show about politics, and boars, and puppets, and some kind of hellish demon lore, it seems. Ugh. But a lot of it is still politics. And so we're gonna take a break and break dance, and then break from that, and come back from the original break and talk about all the popular and often political pros and cons around this decision. And by the end of the video, despite everything I just said about it being subjective, we are going to objectively tell you, specifically you, Sarah, we're gonna tell you if you should have a baby. And I guess who to have it with and what position to use. A little high stakes game of MASH. Sure, let's pretend we'll do that.
Ah, shuckers and corn. The summer is almost over. Gotta pack up the slip and slide, stow the old AC unit, and take all those child mannequins off your lawn. It's stressful getting back into the old routine. That's why I gobble up Next Evo Naturals CBD gummies to take the edge off. Clearly it's worked! They really help with those hard days lugging hundreds of child mannequins into a shed, their faces locked into expressions of horror. Where did they even come from? Why are they so heavy? What's inside of them? I never have to ask these questions with Next Evo CBD, which contains 100% of what they list on the label. They are clinically tested and tummy yummy. No hemp taste, you dig me? You dig me. And it's not just stress they help with either. Next Evo has a sleep support complex that combines CBD with melatonin so you can get to sleep easier, even when you know, deep in your gut, that there's no good answer to why a bunch of child mannequins showed up on your yard. And every night, you just stand at the window looking at your shed, wondering, why and how? So slow down the news ticker in your mind. Upgrade to better natural solutions from Next Evo Naturals. Go to nextevo.com and use promo code MORENEWS to get 25% off. That's 25% off at Next Evo, NEXTEVO.com. Promo code MORENEWS. I nailed it.
Aw, geez. Hey, folks, let me tell you, there is nothing worse than when I cook myself a steaming bowl of potato soup, and then when I go to get the strawberry syrup, to mix in the soup, I find my cupboard's empty. You can't have potato soup without strawberry syrup. But hey, with DoorDash grocery delivery, you can get exactly what you need and fast. We all use DoorDash to order restaurant meals, but now you can get groceries too. They have access to thousands of grocery stores, and with a Dash Pass membership, you get that access for a $0 delivery fee. I don't have to pay extra to whip up my homemade milk pasta or gravel cheese sandwich. Listen here, Mac. It's just like if you picked out groceries for yourself, but in an app. You can pick substitutions right there on your phone so that DoorDash will deliver exactly what you need. And right now, you can get 50% off your first DoorDash order up to a $20 value when you use code MORENEWS at checkout. Limited time offer, terms apply. That's 50% off up to $20, no minimum subtotal, and 0 delivery fees on your first order when you download the DoorDash app in the App Store and enter code MORENEWS. Heck, maybe I'll give you my special jelly ham pizza recipe. Yum. Don't forget that's code MORENEWS for 50% off your first order with DoorDash. We're back and we are so cool, bro. A little out of breath, but my moves were fresh. We were just talking about the very personal decision around whether or not to have kids and how it has, for some silly reason, become everyone's business. But having babies shouldn't be something the world decides for you. Unless you're Al Pacino, in which case, stop it, Al. Just stop it. Jesus Christ, stop having kids. You're ancient, man. Ancient, primordial sperm. Anywho, we were talking about the larger political and ideological reasons for which people seem to have kids, despite not necessarily liking kids. And speaking of our elderlies, one reason you should apparently feel obligated to have kids is for the sake of the economy as the nation's olds die out. For you see, it is the sacred duty of motherhood to create the labor force of the future, one 9-month pregnancy at a time. Oh, look at his little high-vis vest. Oh, that'll keep you safe from an accidental mangling, little guy. You see, we are now apparently at a population emergency, the opposite of a baby boom, a baby whimper, a whimper snapper, a catastrophic baby implosion. I don't know, we're running out of babies to supply the future's workforce, like baby chimney sweep, baby retail worker, nurse baby. Birth rates are declining in the United States, so this Bloomberg article says it's a population emergency. Quote, there will be ever fewer workers to pay the benefits of an ever larger pool of retirees. And without a growing supply of new workers, new private investment has a harder time generating consistent, positive, real returns. When I look at the face of a smiling, innocent child, I first consider how they will someday generate consistent, positive, real returns. Because I'm f***ed up. This NBC article warns that we're not making enough babies to replace ourselves, so when we're old and feeble, there will be a labor shortage. And unless we invent some robot to gain consciousness and revolt, we'll be f***ed. This actually brings us to something called the old bulge.
Don't let erectile dysfunction get in the way.
Oh, no, sorry. Not that kind of old bulge. Although, I'll never pass up on a reminder that old people looking at you, Pacino.
She got a great ass!
So actually, the old bulge is the concern that old people will have to work longer because there's not a younger workforce to replace them. 17% of the US population is 65 or older, which is predicted to increase to 23% by 2060, meaning that a growing proportion of the population will need programs like Social Security or elder care. As we already noted, taking care of our elders is something the US already struggles with compared to other countries. So, how do we fight the old bulge rather than cutting off Cialis supply lines? It's true that births are on the decline, and a growing number of adults are deciding not to have children. As I said before, a lot of that has to do with affordability. Okay then, if we're so worried about future labor, we could make having children more affordable. But even if this doesn't make up for a future population shortage, how else could we get more people into a country? Like, is there some system for people to move from some outside source to be inside a different country? To migrate into? Oh, right, immigration. That's the word I was pretending not to remember. The obvious alternative to both future labor shortage and Social Security shortage is opening up your country to more immigrants. But that's not typically mentioned in these sorts of articles that are worried about birth rates falling. Very weird, isn't it? That the people who are really concerned about population decline aren't scrambling to open up our country to immigration. It's almost like there's another component to this that we're missing.
So it's hilarious if you think about the amount of energy they spend shouting at anyone who notices the numbers. The great replacement theory, that's racist. Again, I would argue race has nothing to do with this. The numbers tell a very clear story. Americans are not replacing themselves naturally by having children in a country that's increasingly hostile to children, and immigration is making up the difference. Why don't we have a right to be mad about that?
Oh, right, racism. That's the other thing I was pretending not to remember. The Great Replacement is a white supremacist ideology that claims that white people are being replaced by foreigners. It was first popularized by French weirdo Renaud Camus, who claimed that there was a globalist conspiracy to replace white French people with non-white immigrants. He's also a creepy old man who literally lives isolated in a French castle. But because of thinkers like Renaud Camus, falling birth rates being compensated by immigration is seen as a national threat. Fox News spells it out blatantly. They say American women, or rather middle-class and wealthy American women, need to have more children so we aren't replaced by mass immigration. The author of that article, Jeremy Carl, writes, "The notion that we can simply import foreigners to make up for the child-rearing job we have refused to do ourselves completely ignores the cultural, civic, and economic impacts of immigration, as well as the impacts to ourselves when we bring in foreign adults as a substitute for raising our own children. Using immigration as a substitute for having enough of our own children leads us down an easy and comfortable but ultimately perilous route." Jeremy never quite explains what this peril is, other than it means the demographic shift would be less likely to lean Republican and vague cultural collapse. This is a sanitized version of the Great Replacement theory, which, as a reminder, has been used as a justification for multiple mass shootings targeting minorities. While it feels weird to have to debunk an ideology that is cited by murderous racists, hey, let's do that. According to the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, countries with low birth rates didn't actually experience larger rates of immigration in the following 20 years. What this means is that immigration didn't end up filling the holes left by low fertility rates. So there you go. White supremacist ideology, fact-checked. I'm sure white supremacists are simply misinformed and will change their minds when presented with actual data. And not to dwell on this, but when you think about what the perceived threat is, it's literally just cultures slowly intermingling, a thing that America has been doing for its entire existence. That's literally what they're scared of. That over time, so-called white or Christian culture will be replaced with other scary cultures. Not through a violent overthrow, but just cultures naturally befriending and having sex with each other, combined with demographic shifts.
It's not the location and the geography that I identify with. Yeah, I like the rolling hills and I like the purple mountains majesty and all that too. But what I like most is the culture and philosophy that was distinctly Western Anglo-Saxon. And that's what it was. And so when these other groups come and you say, well, as long as they don't bring their, but they have brought their culture with them. So you can say as long as they don't, but they have and they will continue to. So let's forget about that because that's exactly what they're doing. And of course, why wouldn't they when the original inhabitants, well, the original inhabitants, of course, were Native Americans, but forget about that for a second. Everyone else has. When the original inhabitants of at least the United States of America are dying off because we've decided we're too cool to have kids, then why wouldn't they bring their culture? Because there's a cultural void. What I'm saying is that when we die off, as we have been, we have left a cultural void. And that void will be filled with this other hodgepodge of cultures.
Thanks, Matt, you unquestionably racist man. So that's the big threat, otherwise known as natural progression. It's like trying to fist fight the ocean. And it's a fear purely based on racism with zero logic behind it. And so there might come a day where opening our borders will simply be something we have to do, or dare I say, get to do, no matter what a group of racists says. Professor Christopher Murray, health economist and global health researcher, believes that having lower fertility rates means we will go from the period where it's a choice to open borders or not to frank competition for migrants as there won't be enough. In other words, our population will dwindle so much that we will want more immigrants in the United States. This would likely be both a social and economic conservative's worst nightmare. Because if immigrants are actually in demand and competed for, they can then demand higher wages and better treatment. In a global labor shortage, those living the global south or those migrating for economic opportunities have more leverage for higher pay and more dignity in labor. This would mean a redistribution of wealth from the most wealthy, and is probably why people like Elon Musk are so concerned about population decline and ravenous for automation. As Musk wrote on Twitter, population collapse due to low birth rates is a much bigger risk to civilization than global warming. Why? He doesn't explain, he just says, mark these words. So, I am marking them. Consider them marked. but I do have a few concerns. For starters, maybe we shouldn't base policy around ultra-rich people who fear they can't exploit workers. But also, for someone who makes a lot of them, Elon Musk isn't exactly an expert in raising kids. He is personally repopulating the Earth by using IVF with one of his employees, you know. Just the classic American family unit. His opinion of fathering a newborn was, quote, "There's not much I can do." And even his grown children don't like him because he doesn't support them emotionally and is a gigantic asshole. So, much like Dennis Prager, it seems like he doesn't actually like children, but just wants to make a bunch of them for vague ideological reasons. Also, here's a self-driving Tesla performing a late-term abortion on a child-sized mannequin. Well, it sorta hit the brakes after the impact, so that's something. Seems like the population crash isn't the kind of crash Elon should be focused on, huh? Anyway, fun clip. Absolutely gonna be showing that one again in an upcoming episode. By the way, population collapse doesn't actually seem imminent. Despite a decline of births, right now the population isn't declining and is set to peak at 2064 at over 9.5 billion and decline to just under 9 billion in 2100, which is not a cataclysmic population crash. Some projections show the rate of population growth slowing but not turning negative, and think we're actually looking at a population increase to a little over 10 billion in 2100. Heck, maybe at that point, we'll have too many people and can do a Hunger Game or two. I would host the shit out of a Hunger Game. You know I would. So it seems like we don't actually have to worry about this, no matter what a rich weirdo going through an insufferable midlife crisis claims. However, there is one very important person we forgot to talk to whose opinion matters the most on whether you procreate, and that person's name is Dr. Jesus H. Christ. Generally speaking, religions encourage their members to have children, usually by saying it's God's will in order to increase the number of that religion's members. Basically, birthing them an army. As an aside, if you are a fan of this show, you do actually, in order to increase the number of that religion's members. Basically, birthing them an army. As an aside, if you are a fan of this show, you do actually need to pop out some babies immediately and then make those babies watch this show and also learn karate. Warmbo onesies are available in our shop. Anyway, this is the philosophy of the more extreme quiverful movement, a Christian ideology that started in the 20th century that is against all forms of birth control, including natural forms like planning your sex based on the monthly fertility cycle to try to avoid pregnancy, which, as an aside, is not a super reliable birth control method. So we're all clear. They're all about having as many children as possible, as blessings from God. They use that line from a psalm that says, "The fruit of the womb is his reward, as arrows are in the hand of a mighty man." I guess, strictly speaking, children could be arrows. You know, if you put like a really sharp and pointy hat on him and fired him from a crossbow. This idea of children as an army gets pretty creepy the more you read into it. Nancy Campbell, a contemporary leader of the quiverful movement, says, "The womb is such a powerful weapon. It's a weapon against the enemy." Can I just say, kind of fucked up to see a womb and children as weapons against the enemy? Who is the enemy, you may ask? Well, according to Campbell, it's Muslims. Because of course, she claims we look across the Islamic world and we see that they are outnumbering us in their family size. And they are, in many places and many countries, taking over those nations without a jihad, just by multiplication. So yeah, we're back to the racist and xenophobic great replacement thing, where somehow children are pawns in some kind of ethno-nationalist chess game, which seems to be a feature of many natalist philosophies. They're almost always racists. Weird pattern there. Why can't it ever be people wanting a cool personal army of children to rob banks with and fight mutant turtles? But no matter what kind of baby army you're trying to create, either in the name of whiteness or Christianity or boss babies or a gaggle of liberal cucks. The effect is the same. Women are pressured to have children, as if we were born with the moral duty to create children for some kind of eternal war against fill in the blank. We, of course, see this philosophy represented in the anti-abortion movement that views the woman's duty to bear children as more important than her own bodily autonomy. In fact, the duty to have children is so paramount, the idea of women being able to enjoy sex without the consequence of bearing children is often seen as immoral. If you see women as fleshy 3D printers for your white baby army, then abortion is sabotage against your baby munitions factories. This is not speculation. Conservatives literally talk about how abortion is undermining the great population war between our babies and their babies. Former Iowa House Republican Steve King said, "You cannot rebuild your civilization with somebody else's babies. You've got to keep your birth rate up, and that you need to teach your children your values." It's a weird sentiment, given that the U.S. is a country of immigrants and babies born here are U.S. citizens by birthright. So who is this somebody else's babies? Well, it all comes back to that racist great replacement idea. Head of CPAC, Matt Schlapp, directly referenced the great replacement conspiracy theory, saying, "If you say there's a population problem in a country, but you're killing millions of your own people every year through legalized abortion every year, if that were to be reduced, some of that problem is solved. If you're worried about this quote-unquote replacement, why don't we start there? Start with allowing our own people to live." When head Republicans are explicitly saying that they're anti-abortion because it means fewer soldiers in their weird natalist war against foreigners, it makes me question whether GOP Congresswoman Mary Miller saying this was really a gaffe or more of a Freudian slip.
I want to thank you for the historic victory for life in the Supreme Court yesterday.
Her campaign manager says she meant to say a historic victory for the right to life, which, sure, maybe she did. But also it didn't stop everyone from clapping, because for the far right, the question of if you should have a baby depends on who you are and where you are from. It's not a question of love, but a deeply ideological decision rooted in racism, which ironically for the so-called party of families doesn't seem like a very good recipe for happy children or parents. And when you take into account that this is a country of immigrants, it's also highly confusing who they are really talking about when they worry about birth declines. There's this idea of a true American linked to white supremacy versus the others. But what's a true American? Someone here for a few generations? Certainly not too far back, because then you get to Native Americans and genocide, and we're not allowed to talk about that because that makes white people feel sad. But this is why these people think an embryo or a fetus or even a hypothetical child is more preferable than an immigrant, because that fetus, by belonging to this superior group, is more worthy and deserving of opportunities in the US than an immigrant. And that embryo or fetus or hypothetical child is also more important than the desires of women, because women's purpose in this framework is to reinforce the supremacy of the superior group, which, hey, is fucked up. It's fucked up to think of having babies as a utilitarian act rather than one from love. It's a sad frame of mind leading to a weird and sad existence that would lead to sad children. So maybe that's not a good idea or reason to have a baby, okay? Just cross that one off the list. You know what's not fucked up? The things we are about to very passionately talk about in these ads. They're kind of like a baby, you know? In that they're small and they're cute and sometimes annoying and made from sperm and eggs. Be right back.
Well, well, well. Look who it is. Pretty bold of you to show up. But since I have you here, I want to tell you about Stamps.com. Not to be confused with Scamps.com, the site that lets you rent mischievous little rascals for cheap. Way too cheap. Like arson levels of cheap. Like, so, that should be shut down. The government should shut that down. If you have a small or large or even medium business, then you know the holidays are going to be a big old pain. But with Stamps.com, you can speed up your business by conducting all your postage needs right at your home computer. All you need is a printer, and you can create postage for USPS and UPS packages. They'll even send you a scale. My scale got stolen by Jimmy, who is 45, by the way. You think I couldn't tell, Scamps.com? The newsy hat was a nice touch, though. Nice try. Listen, shush up and listen. You can even arrange a package pickup through Stamps.com dashboard. Not to mention huge discounts, like up to 84%, that is big, 84% off USPS and UPS rates. Seriously, it's very convenient if you run a small business. I know multiple people who use this service for their business, and it's genuinely useful. Unlike Jimmy. If you can hear me, I need my car back, please, Jimmy. Just, if you can, Jimmy! He lives down the hall. I'll talk to him later. Get your business ready for the holiday rush. Get started with Stamps.com today. Sign up with promo code MORENEWS for a special offer that includes a 4-week trial, plus free postage, and a free digital scale I'll get it later. No long-term commitments or contracts. Just go to Stamps.com, click the microphone at the top of the page, and enter code MORENEWS. Stamps. They go on mail!
Oh no, that bike courier is stuck in the basement again. That's my joke to draw you into this thrilling ad for Shopify. Now that you're on the edge of your seat, I'm about to tell you about how Shopify is able to unite your online and retail in-person store that you own. You know how you own a store? Well, with Shopify's point-of-sale system, you can manage your online and in-person purchases under one roof. Because combining things is good. Like combining a bear trap with your basement stairs, which is a callback to the first thing I said, haha. So, just to recap, with Shopify, you get a command center for your retail and online stores, giving you the power to track every sale across both stores to give you one source of data. You can track everything from money to inventory. And heckaroo, they even have plug-and-play tools to let you market yourself on the social medias. Like how I advertise my discount bike store. Because of the basement, you see. Joke complete. So sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/morenews, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/morenews, all lowercase, to take your retail business to the next level today. Shopify.com/morenews. Okay, cool. We're back and even cooler than last time. So, before the break, we talked about the arguments people, specifically the right wing, make to pressure you to have babies. But what about the opposite? What about people who are all for sucking that baby right back up in you because maybe babies are a menace to society? There are plenty of discussions and articles about how maybe you shouldn't have children, specifically because of climate change, both in terms of the personal hardships these future people will have and the carbon emissions per capita. So hey, climate change. It's definitely something we should each take personal responsibility for and not view as a systemic problem at all. Recycle your cans and wear enough condoms to stop global warming, folks. Just make sure they're sustainable condoms and cut your condoms up before throwing them out so sea turtles don't choke on them during weird sea turtle sex. If you decide to have children, perhaps your spawn shall wreak havoc upon the earth, supping too greedily off of Mother Nature's teat till it's dry and chapped. Do we have a picture of Mother Nature's dry, chapped teat? Hot. So, babies, are they the planet killers? Often the idea behind this is that too many births will exacerbate climate change through overpopulation. There's often this hypocrisy when it comes to worrying about overpopulation. We focus on poor countries who are overpopulated, and we see them as a burden on the rest of the world. People who just need to stop having so many babies because they're causing overpopulation. Interestingly, though, the countries that are the worst contributors to climate change also have some of the lowest birth rates. Compare this map, where countries with the lowest birth rates are depicted in green, with this map, where countries with the highest emissions are depicted in dark red. Christmas colors! Festive! 'Tis the season! The erratic, gradually warmer season. So apparently, it's actually the wealthier countries who are the problem. Obviously. In wealthier countries, average consumption of goods and energy is higher, thus people have larger carbon impacts. So if you live in one of these wealthier countries, your baby is going to have a larger carbon footprint than a baby from a poorer country. So one could argue that people from wealthier countries should have fewer children, which they already are. But also, none of this really matters when it comes to climate change. It is, of course, a good thing to give people reproductive choice wherever they live, because reproductive freedom is healthy and can help people who are suffering from poverty or lack of resources. But in terms of overpopulation being the cause of global warming, environmental engineers aren't so certain. While it is true that the planet couldn't sustain continual exponential growth, currently this is not the trend. You know, because of everything we've talked about with fertility rates that are declining globally, mainly due to greater access to contraception. The US fertility rate has been dropping because women and teenagers have more autonomy and are able to choose when or if they want to have children. And since 2008, there's been a decline in unintended pregnancy due to access to abortion and family planning services. Now, obviously, there's been some recent changes to the whole allowing women access to health services and control over their bodies, so we've yet to see how that affects the number of unintended pregnancies in the US. I'm no scientist, but I'm gonna say it'll make that number go up. I did. This is all to say that if you want kids but are worried about overpopulation or climate change, maybe don't worry. Your future child isn't going to be the problem, unless your child becomes the CEO of ExxonMobil, in which case, way to go, asshole. What were you doing all those years? You get my point, though. Climate change is much more hinged on sweeping reforms and regulations than what your genitals do, unless you jizz out smog. Al Pacino. Another aspect affecting birth rate is that millennials are struggling in the having enough money to make a living industry. More millennials are putting off having children because it's simply too expensive, especially given the economic disruption of the pandemic. Millennials, who honestly were just too busy playing Minecraft or whatever to avert the 2 recessions and a pandemic, have experienced a lot of instability when it comes to the housing market, job market, cost of living, and education. So adding a baby to the equation obviously brings more instability and stress. Despite the pressure we put on women to have children and be the main caretaker for them, we sure don't make it easy to be a mother. When it comes to actually funding children, especially children born into low-income families, our government seems to think that it's not their problem. The average cost of childbirth in the US is over $13,000, and with insurance, you still owe $1,000 to $2,500. It's a lot of money. For many people, the high price tag might drive them to opt for a home birth, but home births come with higher risks of both infant and maternal mortality. Also, you need to own a home for that to happen. Millennials have, very rudely, collectively decided to have less net worth than baby boomers or Generation X had at the same age, despite millennials being more well educated. Childcare costs more than $10,000 a year, which represents a chunk of over 10% of the median couple's income, or over 35% for a single parent. And those are just for older children. It can be more than $16,000 a year in childcare for infants. For more information on how we screw over families in terms of childcare, there's some kind of strange, disheveled man on YouTube that rambled about it. No affiliation. And it's about to get worse! During the pandemic, Congress made a record investment in childcare, setting aside $24 billion to help keep the industry afloat. This money went to assisting parents with costs, training workers, and boosting salaries to offset the loss of childcare workers during COVID. However, that money is expiring this month, and as a result, quote, An estimated 70,000 childcare programs, or about 1 in 3, could close as a result of lost funding, causing 3.2 million children to lose care, forcing even more parents to make the impossible choice between staying home with their children or going to work so they can afford to pay for their children. Normally, this is the point at which I go about debunking the argument that this is a reason not to have kids, but for a lot of people, this honestly seems like a very valid dilemma. It's just a grim financial reality, especially in America, and the lack of social safety nets as well as universal health care not only presents financial risks, but health risks as well. The US ranks the worst in maternal mortality when compared with 10 other wealthy countries. Our maternal death rate averages over 17 deaths per 100,000 people versus less than 3 out of 100,000 in countries like Norway, the Netherlands, or New Zealand. And this is likely to only get worse with anti-abortion laws in the US that make childbirth riskier, like forcing people to carry dead fetuses, which is both psychologically horrifying and medically dangerous. In terms of postpartum care, the US philosophy seems to be that it's your problem, and you and your newborn need to bootstrap yourselves. Tiny, cute little newborn bootstraps. We make them out of the ribbons from the Storks bundle. Adorable. Baby bootstraps for sale, never worn. 1 in 4 women have to return to work just 10 days after giving birth, and a report by UNICEF ranks the US last in terms of family-friendly policies out of over 40 other OECD countries. OECD stands for Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and represents relatively high-income economies that theoretically have the resources to give people things like paid leave and healthcare, which the United States doesn't do. Could, but doesn't. Even postpartum depression might not be covered under American insurance, as there are plans that don't include mental health care. And even if it does, you can still be penalized with higher rates by insurance companies for having PPD. Hey, man, you didn't want to go broke? Maybe you should have thought about that before having a mental health reaction to your entire body and brain changing during pregnancy and birth. Should have thought of that. It's like that popular saying, go have a baby in America, go broke. With 0 weeks of mandated paid parental leave, the US is dead last when it comes to all other OECD nations. Though the US doesn't guarantee paid parental leave, we do have the Family Medical Leave Act, which offers eligible employees 12 weeks of unpaid leave a year and requires employers to keep health benefits going, as long as the person has worked at a location for at least 12 months and where the employer has 50 or more employees within 75 miles. And you must ask your employer if you can take advantage of FMLA, and they have to agree to give it to you. And if you've ever had to ask your employer for stuff, you might know it doesn't always go so well. Cody's been asking for years to go home, which is adorable. Never gonna happen. So, if birth is too expensive and you want to have a child, maybe you could just adopt? Well, no, it's getting harder and harder to adopt. Adoption can cost from $15,000 to $45,000, mostly due to legal fees. Obviously, it's important to make sure that children are being adopted out to people who won't harm them, but that's prohibitively expensive for most people. Plus, and I'm certainly not saying an adoption is bad, but there is a history of white supremacy that courses through much of our culture of adoption, which can absolutely have adverse impacts on those children. Okay, so having a baby is gonna cost you no matter how you do it. But what if keeping a baby alive and junk? Surely that is cheap here in America, I ask, knowing the answer is no. Yeah, so of course, conservatives tend to vote against or cut programs that benefit children. After the overturning of Roe v. Wade, Republicans pretended to care about pro-family policy by proposing things like a parental leave through Social Security that the parents would have to pay back either with money or by retiring later. Because Lord knows they can't get the thing for free. We don't even guarantee children food security, and conservatives try to cut food programs for babies, children, and adults, such as the Republican proposed cuts to the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for women, infants, and children. And if you recall, this is the same group that fights against abortion rights and wants everyone to have scores of kids. There's no universal pre-K in the US, as in free preschool, despite the many benefits to children in terms of graduation rates, emotional and social intelligence, and income gains as adults. What's more, conservative groups are vehemently against universal pre-K, saying that it's not something we can afford.
I think it's immoral to make all these promises when you know at the end of the day you can't afford it, we can't afford it. To say preschool for everybody, are you kidding me? We don't have the money for that.
You heard it here. Kids are not worth it. What are they, $32 million Reaper drones? Come on. Too much money on kids. The things that conservatives claim we need to make more of, but not pay for. There have at least been some improvements to how well we take care of children and families in the US, though. Between 2020 and 2021, child tax credits cut child poverty by over 30%, which is a remarkable testament to the effectiveness of social assistance programs. But wait, whoops, okay, it says here we have let it expire. And by we, I mainly mean Joe Manchin, who blocked the bill, which I can only assume is because Joe Manchin hates millions of children. Joe Mean Man. That's what the kids call him. Also, Republicans want to keep school lunches from being free, so we can do fun things like mark children's arms with an I'm poor stamp that says they need lunch money. This way, schoolyard bullying can be streamlined into a brutally efficient Adolf Eichmann-approved manner. But at least kids also have to worry about gun violence, so that's fun. Maybe the fear of being in a school shooting will help distract them from the fact that they can't afford a school lunch. And if you make it through the school day without being shot or shoved into a toilet because of your I'm poor arm stamp, you can go outside, where you may or may not find an actual park that you can safely play in, which parents may or may not be able to reach with their strollers, depending on whether their local sidewalk cuts off right before the freeway on-ramp. Well, okay, maybe kids can just play in their backyards, as long as their millennial parents can afford it, or even find a home. Truly, we should have spent less time reading Harry Potter and more time inheriting wealth and buying up mass amounts of property. That one's on us, fellow millennials. That's on us. But in what magical land could parents be guaranteed time with their vulnerable newborns and support for their children? If America, land of the grimace shake, can't do it, who can? Well, apparently, plenty of other wealthy countries. Over 120 countries provide paid maternity leave by law, and in Finland, it's only about $300 to have a baby. You are guaranteed a midwife to help with the birthing process, and they give out a box of items for newborns to everyone for free. That box has over 60 items, including clothing, blankies, toys, books, thermometer, warm winter items, and more. The baby box is apparently such a cherished Finnish tradition that Finnish journalist Anu Partanen describes it as a way for parents to feel like the whole country is providing for a child. Other countries have also discovered this incredible thing called paternity leave, which increases life satisfaction for mothers, something that America hates. Researchers looked at the impact of earmarked paternity leave in Europe, meaning paternity leave that must be used by the father and can't be transferred to the mother. Their study found that life satisfaction for both mothers and fathers increased by over 10 percentage points. And that, while fathers also benefited in terms of life satisfaction, mothers reported a greater increase than fathers. But if we start giving people crap like parental leave, isn't that taking precious resources from the rest of us? No. Turns out that this helps everyone. In fact, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities makes the claim that generous leave programs, in addition to helping workers, actually ends up helping businesses. Quote, Paid leave policies benefit businesses by improving worker retention and productivity without increasing operating costs and can even produce cost savings. In studies of California's paid leave program, about 90% of businesses reported either a positive or neutral effect on productivity, and almost all businesses, 99%, identified positive or neutral effects on employee morale. So parents and non-parents don't have to duke it out in some kind of money tornado, tossing kids and grabbing dollars in a no-holds-barred contest for who gets to have the meager crumbs left to us by corporations. We could all live better and be happier, and whether or not you have children could be a decision of personal fulfillment. Some people may know that they never want children, but those who are on the fence would be freed up to truly and freely decide whether they want to become parents without the looming threat of financial insecurity. That's neat. Sorry to be a disgusting hippie for a moment, but I do think that childless people and parents are not at odds with one another. If we built a society friendlier for parents, it would also be better for people without children and vice versa. Imagine, if you normalize parental leave, you can also normalize more personal time for non-parents. More vacation time would give parents time with their children, and people without children time with their PS5s and pornography and weed, or, enriching and improving the world in other ways. Allowing people to have full lives outside of work makes it easier to raise a family and better for single people to just live their lives and enjoy things. City planning that would be friendlier to children would also be friendlier for everyone. Safer residential streets for children to play in would be more public space for adults to bike or walk. Child-friendly sidewalk infrastructure would be better for non-child pedestrians and people with disabilities alike. A society that offers free healthcare would make having children less financially difficult and would make medical care for everyone more affordable. The only people who wouldn't benefit from free healthcare would be super rich people with live-in doctors and freezers full of their sperm. Having a less atomized nuclear family society means that people with children will be less isolated and would have more help, and people without children would have the support of the community as they age without needing to have children to avoid being alone and neglected. Free and compassionate care for the elderly would prevent people from feeling like they have to have a family to avoid isolation or dying alone. It would also mean parents and grandparents would have more money and time to invest in their children and grandchildren, and also their PS5 and pornography and weed. More autonomy of choice on whether to have children or not would also be good for children. If you force people to have children they don't want or guilt them into it, it's not always going to lead to a happy home for the child. It might lead to having this guy as your parent.
If my father had said to me, Dennis, the world is better because you are in it, I would have believed that even though he was never drunk, that he was actually drunk.
Whoops! Maybe you should have given that kid a little more love and he wouldn't have founded a sham university. So, should you have a baby? The thing is, I can't answer this question for you. I can't even answer it for myself. I always thought that I'd be a mom someday, and not just your news mommy and or aunt. Maybe I still will have actual children, but for all the reasons laid out here today, honestly, it's looking less and less likely. The decision to have children shouldn't be a polarizing political choice. But that said, the way in which we structure our society to be friendly or unfriendly to parents or non-parents is certainly political. And so while we shouldn't demand who can and can't have kids, we should demand our country be a place where people who want to have and raise kids can. And if less people feel like they can have kids, then perhaps there's a problem in that country. And perhaps the people obsessed with birth rates and population numbers are either trying to distract people or just missing the point entirely. I know this is weird, bordering on perverted, but we might be able to improve society in a way that one can freely choose whether you want to become a parent without life sucking. Maybe just maybe, life could suck a little bit less for everyone? Or, alternatively, baby coal miners, they can get in all those little coal crevices really good. Oh, look at that little guy. Oh, who's got the black wong? Is it you? Do you have the black wong? Yes, you do, you little cutie. Adorable. Yeah, let's go with the mind babies. Everyone have mind babies from now on. I decree it. Oh god, wait a minute. Is Warmbo technically my child? Yes? Oh my god, what have I done? Get him in the coal mine, quick! God, my child? Yes? Oh my god, what have I done? Get him in the coal mine, quick! Hello, we've reached the end of the video. Thank you for watching all the way to the end of this video. Okay, what are the things I'm supposed to say? Patreon, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/somemore-news. We have a podcast called Even More News, which I'm on every week. So is Cody. It's fun, it's cute, we have a good time. Also, this episode you can listen to in the audio feed like a podcast, if that's your vibe. Merch store, we got that. Baby Warmbo onesies, right? Speaking of Warmbo, I've thought about this and I didn't actually birth him. I would have remembered that. He's not. My point is that I don't think that I have to take any sort of responsibility over what he does or does not do.
Mom, I killed a guy!
Shut the fuck up.
This is Taiwan. This small island nation is filthy rich. When you look past the geopolitics that Taiwan is constantly dragged into and dare to shine the spotlight on its economy, what you get is this.
Taiwan. Industrial output rose 4.5% in August.
The outlook for Taiwan's economy.
Taiwan has benefited from export, which has benefited the economy as a whole.
Taiwan even emerged as the second fastest growing economy in Asia after Japan.
Taiwan grew its economy by more than 3% last year, growing faster than mainland China for the first time in decades.
Taiwan has become a very rich nation over the past few decades, becoming home to many crucial companies that the world simply cannot exist without. Its economic transformation from being a poor colony to being a powerful rich nation with powerful rich friends is one of the ages, and it deserves proper detailing, something we're going to do today. Throughout this video, we will examine the economic and political history of Taiwan, the reforms it has put into place over the years, and just how it has become richer than China. So buckle up, this is going to be an interesting story about an interesting nation. Do you know what else is interesting? The fact that by pressing the like button, you can help push the reach of this video on the algorithm. So please, take a second to like the video. It would mean a lot to us if the work we do gets to be accessed by more and more people who can learn from it, globally. Right, let's get back to the basics. In order to understand the present state of the nation, we need to start by looking at its past and what it is that paved the way for modern Taiwan to be where it is today. So let's have a crack at it. Looking at the history files, you'll find that very little is known about Taiwan before the 17th century when the Dutch arrived. When these Dutch came to the island nation in around 1622, they found a population mix of mainly the Austronesian Aborigines and a sprinkling of Chinese and Japanese people. The economic structure that existed at the time comprised the Aborigine women practicing subsistence agriculture, while Aborigine men harvested deer for export. As for our handful of Chinese and Japanese people, the Chinese, most of them were merchants and they exported, surprise surprise, deer skins in exchange for salt and other basics. It was a simple economy done at a humble scale, but when the Dutch came, they decided to kick it up a notch. They built a harbor and their first fort in what is now present-day Tainan City, cementing what was already a trading ground as an important economic port. As time went by and the Dutch secured control over Taiwan, they made sure to benefit from the economy. They mostly didn't interfere with the economic ways of the people, but through taxation and new forms of agriculture, they made sure to benefit from the nation. The Tainan Harbor, on the other hand, as expected, grew in importance as an international entrepot. As more people, mostly Chinese, flocked to the bustling Taiwan from nearby shores, the island started growing more rice and sugar, with the latter soon becoming Taiwan's primary export. Even when Koxinga, a Chinese-Japanese sea lord, drove the Dutch off the island in 1661, the nation continued to grow its agriculture bit by bit, with minor changes taking place in the political arena, but economic growth being cemented either way. One thing to note was that all this time, the Chinese population was slowly growing in the nation. This is not surprising given where Taiwan is in reaction to China. Here's a reminder. When the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty in Chinese history, rose, it defeated Koxinga's grandson and took control of Taiwan in 1683. This is when Taiwan was integrated into the Chinese Empire. It will remain a part of the Chinese Empire until it was ceded to Japan in 1895. Some will say it still is part of the Chinese Empire, but we will get into that later on. The Qing government originally saw control of Taiwan as an economic burden that had to be borne in order to keep the island out of the hands of pirates. In the first years of occupation, the Qing government shipped as many Chinese residents as possible back to the mainland, as they saw it as a non-crucial and non-productive area. Yes, the very same Taiwan that now has a higher GDP per capita than China was once viewed by China as useless. Talk about how tables turn. When the Qing dynasty started shipping Chinese people back to China, the island lost over 1/3 of its Chinese population. China viewed Taiwan with such discontent that travel to Taiwan for anyone who wasn't a male migrant worker was made illegal until 1732. This facilitated illegal immigration to China, putting together the slow but natural increase of the population and the heavy illegal migration of people. The Chinese presence kept growing in Taiwan. Those who were on the island pushed the fold of economic progression in agriculture and entrepreneurial tasks. The original Aboriginal people learned also from these skill sets, and that further drove economic progression on the land. Remember when we said that Taiwan had become a primary sugar producer during the Dutch era? Well, the nation went on to prosper during a sugar boom in the early 18th century, but afterward, however, its sugar industry struggled. You see, the sugar farms and sugar mills remained in Taiwan's small-scale operations. When they had to compete against foreign production, they came up short, and hence the primary exports suffered. This led to the country becoming poorer, with particular emphasis on the south of the nation, where most of the sugar mills and sugar production had been taking place. Just like every empire and colonizer, the Qing dynasty was not to last forever. However, something happened during the last years of the Qing dynasty's rule in Taiwan that forever changed the landscape of modern global politics. You see, the Qing dynasty made Taiwan a full province of China. That was a claim that for the next decades and in the next decades to come, and still to this modern day, will be a source of contention and massive geopolitics. After having passed through the hands of the Dutch and the Chinese, Taiwan eventually passed through the hands of the Japanese after the Sino-Japanese War. Japan's time ruling over Taiwan is particularly memorable because during this period, Japan endeavored to modernize the small island nation. You can say that Taiwan benefited a lot because it was basically Japan's first attempt at colonialism, and they virtually wanted a little Tokyo in Taiwan. When the dust settled, economically speaking, the experiment was a raging success. By the time the Japanese left, it had successfully established order, eradicated disease, built infrastructure, and created a modern economy, the basis of what we have now. In fact, at the peak of its colonial period under Japan, Taiwan was the most advanced place in East Asia outside Japan itself. Japan came with the mindset that they were going to magnify what was already working and then remove all the barriers that existed. To this end, agriculture in Taiwan received a major boost. The policymakers in charge put a lot of emphasis on agriculture, as it was the backbone of Taiwan. Through various policies, they improved rice production with new seeds and farming techniques to the point where there was more than enough internally and exports started again. Although sugarcane continued to be grown mainly on family farms, sugar processing was modernized and sugar once again became Taiwan's leading export, further adding to the development of the economy. As Japan continually modernized Taiwan, large Japanese refiners holding regional monopoly power came to control the industry, pushing it to its limits of development. This, however, did not take the small refineries out of business, but it did mark a period of change and transition. Despite the modernization that Taiwan was going through, Taiwanese sugar remained uncompetitive on the international market. It, however, was sold duty-free within the protected Japanese market, meaning that it always had a market, and it had one at competitive prices. At this time, all the new farming methods introduced by the Japanese also bore dividends, as rice quickly rose to become Taiwan's second major export crop. Under Japanese rule, Taiwan's agricultural output shot up so high that by 1930, almost half of Taiwan's agricultural production was being exported. It wasn't just agriculture that prospered. The whole nation underwent a wave of modernization. Everything that could be developed was developed. The railroads that Taiwan barely had were expanded by a factor of almost 10 times just to propel the nation ahead. With new industries booming everywhere and trade expanding, Taiwan was electrified, which further served to grow said industries. Along with the railway that ran the length of the nation, modern roads and bridges were built. A modern land survey was carried out to better utilize available land and develop it. Large rents were eliminated, and those receiving these rents were compensated with bonds by the Japanese policymakers. To add to all this, several banks were established, and reorganized irrigation districts began borrowing money to make improvements. Since many Japanese soldiers had died of disease, improving the island's sanitation and disease environment was also a top priority, and that was done to perfection. One of the resulting effects of this was that the population size grew quickly because the death rates due to failing health systems had fallen. It is no exaggeration to say that in this period, Taiwan became a bustling hub of glory, second only to Japan itself in the region. This was further cemented by the fact that growth in Taiwan's per capita economic product during this colonial period roughly kept up with that of Japan. The native Taiwanese population's per capita consumption grew about 1% per year, slower than the growth in consumption in Japan, but greater than the growth in China. Better property rights enforcement, population growth, transportation improvements, and protected agricultural markets caused the value of land to increase quickly, but real wage rates increased little. Most Taiwanese farmers did own some land, but since the poor were more dependent on wages, income inequality increased. It wasn't all rosy though. Remember, Taiwan was a colony, so ultimately Japan ran the show, and in running the show over their colony, Japan could be, well, rough. At what was their first crack at colonialism, Japanese policymakers put in place harsh punishment to enforce the law. They basically made sure everyone knew who was running the show, and that the show would run smoothly. Perhaps what is critical to note in Japan's time ruling over Taiwan is the dilemma of colony versus territory. This will come back to play a big role in the future, so let's look at it. Japan struggled over whether to make Taiwan a part of Japan or to allow it to be administratively separate and to some degree self-governing. If they had made Taiwan a part of Japan, things would be very different in the modern age. Global geopolitics would be an entirely different animal. As for whether that would be better or for worse is something that's up for debate. However, the Japanese ultimately didn't assimilate Taiwan. All they did was to force the Japanese language, culture, and heritage on the people. At that point, it felt oppressive, but certain advantages came out of this. For example, it gave them access to science and technology that the Japanese had, and a better educational system. These were seeds for economic progress that was to be continued later. Taiwan would go on to also become militarily sound, as during the Second Sino-Japanese War, Taiwan and Japan built several military bases on the island and used them as a base of attack. Eventually, however, Japan lost Taiwan after the Second World War, and the island was rid of the Japanese invaders. Though the Taiwanese people had largely fought together with the Japanese, the island was not entirely devastated post-war as Japan was. The recovery period from the war, however, was slow, and the economy of Taiwan, though not in shambles, was definitely not what it was pre-war. Around this time, things got interesting. In mainland China, war had been raging as the civil war between the nationalists and communists ravaged China. However, as they steadily lost ground to the communist forces of Mao Zedong, Chinese nationalist leaders departed for the island of Taiwan, where they established their new capital. And this action marked the beginning of the Two China scenario that left mainland China under communist control and made global politics to this very day a complicated game. The moving of the nationalist encampment to Taiwan, though ending direct military conflict between the two parties in China, marked the beginning of a new age for China. The years following that were hard as Taiwan was experiencing hyperinflation, amongst other things. The island was still also heavily dependent on foreign aid, something which America gladly provided as the world's big brother. The problems in the economy were easy to see and direct to see. On one hand, Taiwan's agricultural economy was left in shambles by the events of the 1940s. What used to be the backbone of the economy was now devastated, with Taiwan now struggling big time. Remember earlier when we said that Japan boosted Taiwan's agricultural markets by making all their goods duty-free? Well, with Japan out of the picture, all those perks went away. Taiwan lost its protected Japanese markets, and the low interest rate formal sector loans to which even tenant farmers had access in the 1930s were no longer available. It was a bad time, and America stepped in to help. With American help, the government implemented a land reform program in a bid to turn the economy around. This program brought some crucial much-needed changes. Firstly, it sold public land to tenant farmers in a bid to empower them. Secondly, it limited rent to 37.5% of the expected harvest and severely restricted the size of individual land holdings, forcing landlords to sell most of their land to the government in exchange for stocks and bonds valued at 2.5 times the land's annual expected harvest. This land was then redistributed. The land reform increased equality among the farm population and strengthened government control of the countryside. Its justice and effect on agricultural investment and productivity are still hotly debated, but at the time the effects were transparent. As Taiwan began to get new wind under its sails, industrialization started to take place. By the last few years of the 1950s, Taiwan had become known for its cheap manufactured exports. These were cheap particularly because they were produced by small enterprises bound together by flexible subcontracting networks. It was the breaking of a new age for Taiwan, as its exports finally became competent on the world stage. This industrialization of Taiwan can mainly be attributed to three crucial factors. These were A, the decline in land per capita, B, the change in export markets, and lastly, C, government policy. You see, between 1940 and 1962, Taiwan's population increased at an annual rate of slightly over 3%. This cut the amount of land per capita in half. Taiwan's agricultural exports have been sold tariff-free at higher than the world market prices in pre-war Japan, while Taiwan's only important pre-war manufactured exports, imitation Panama hats, faced a 25% tariff in the US, their primary market. After the war, agricultural products generally faced the greatest trade barriers. As for government policy, Taiwan went through a period of import substitution policy in the 1950s, followed by the promotion of manufactured exports in the 1960s and 1970s. Subsidies were available for certain manufacturers under both regimes. During the import substitution regime, domestic manufacturers were protected both by tariffs and multiple overvalued exchange rates. Under the later export promotion regime, export processing zones were set up in which privileges were extended to businesses that produced products that would not be sold domestically. All this sounds hectic, but it ushered in something glorious. This period in Taiwan's history has now come to be known globally as the Taiwan Miracle. In a nutshell, the Taiwan Miracle was a period in the late 20th century when Taiwan's economy experienced an unprecedented growth rate, with the country also witnessing rapid industrialization. Taiwan's gross national product recorded an explosive growth of a staggering 360% from 1965 to 1986. Imagine that! Even more impressive was the country's global industrial production output, which grew by 680% in the 1965 to 1986 period. Collectively, the Taiwanese miracle can be attributed to government policy and reform. The government made the business environment flexible, allowing domestic companies to quickly adapt to changes in the international market, and a special brand of capitalism, where the government completely protected the market. The Taiwanese government also focused on importing the latest industrial technologies from foreign countries, an act which accelerated the development of the country. The enabling business environment and political goodwill from the government to support businesses triggered a mass exodus of businesses and firms from mainland China who settled in Taiwan. The movement of businesses also brought with it Chinese business elites and intellectuals to the island, which further aided the development of the land. The country had a mostly uneducated and undereducated population, which was also quite young. And this population offered cheap labor to the domestic companies. Cheap labor meant that Taiwan-based companies had low production costs, resulting in high profits. I mean, who doesn't like cheap labor? There is a dark side to that, but that's a story for another day. As we said a few minutes ago, the United States also played an essential role in the growth of Taiwan during this period and sent to the island nation financial aid amounting to $4 billion between 1945 and 1965. Look, we know you can't send us $4 billion in assistance, but please don't forget to drop a like and maybe comment on the video. Maybe we can have our own Business Basics miracle of 2023. American assistance to Taiwan during this period also came in the form of military and food aid. In education, the country aimed to have its citizens fluent in English, Mandarin, and Taiwanese. Mandarin was seen as necessary since it was the official language in mainland China, while English was selected as the country embraced globalization. Primary education, in which 70% of Taiwanese children had participated under the Japanese, became universal, and students in higher education increased manyfold. Yes, quite the growth and quite the period of improvement for Taiwan. That period ushered it into the modern age of technology and innovation, something Taiwan completely blew out of the park. At present, super developed technology and manufacturing sectors in Taiwan's diversified economy are part of what places the island state among the richest countries in Asia. In fact, Taiwan is known as one of the 4 Asian tigers for its high-growth economy. The 4 Asian tigers are the high-growth economies of Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. Fueled by exports and rapid industrialization, the 4 Asian tigers have consistently maintained high levels of economic growth since the 1960s and have collectively joined the ranks of the world's wealthiest nations. Hong Kong and Singapore are among the most prominent worldwide financial centers, while South Korea and Taiwan are essential hubs for the global manufacturing of automobiles and electronic components, as well as information technology. Speaking of information technology, it's impossible to talk about just how much of a powerhouse Taiwan is now without mentioning that this is one sector that they completely dominated the world in with their semiconductors. We have made a video on this before when we spoke of America punishing China, but there are still a lot of elements we never touched on regarding Taiwan, so let's get into it. As you probably already know, semiconductors are crucial to the technology that powers the modern world. For decades, Taiwan has stood as the world's leading manufacturer of semiconductor chips. Let's dive deeper into the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing industry and examine just how and why it has become indispensable to the world. Most of the microchips that we use come from Taiwan, or at least go through a process in Taiwan. This has become a huge prop for the economy and will remain that way for decades to come. Most of that comes from one root, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the world's largest and most valuable semiconductor manufacturer. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, more popularly known as the TSMC, is one of the 12 largest companies in the world. At present, it has a market cap of $482.85 billion, but plainly, it's just an economic powerhouse. TSMC was founded by Morris Chang, a Taiwanese American in 1987. Capitalizing off the Taiwanese miracle to try and cement something long-lasting, Morris Chang began a move that now has him referred to by most as the father of semiconductors. During the Taiwanese miracle, a lot of Western companies were outsourcing their manufacturing needs to Asia, and so Chang relocated to Taiwan to capitalize on that prime golden opportunity. After setting everything up, TSMC opened its first fully owned semiconductor fabrication foundry in 1990. This was followed up by the opening of Taiwan's first 8-inch semiconductor fabrication foundry in 1993. The company then proceeded to open a US fab foundry in 1997 and was able to reach a 1 million wafer capacity. Because of its rapid growth and financial excellence, TSMC became the first Taiwanese firm to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange. TSMC has been growing at a rapid pace, and all this has served to bless Taiwan's economy. The company has pioneered 7nm and 5nm production processes for semiconductor manufacturing and was the first firm to use extreme ultraviolet lithography in semiconductor fabrication processes. The company has grown so large that it has the estimated global capacity to produce 13,300mm equivalent wafers per year. If you don't understand what that means, let us just say this. That's a huge number. TSMC now has subsidiaries in China, the United States, Singapore, and offices in China, Europe, India, Japan, South Korea, and even the United States. You get what we're putting across. The company has now grown super huge, and with it, a good portion of Taiwan's economy. In the sector of semiconductors, not even China can hold a candle to Taiwan now. The company single-handedly accounts for 55.5% of the global semiconductor market share. On top of TSMC, Taiwan also has several other companies like ASE Technology, AU Optronics, Mediatek, Lite-On Technology, and United Microelectronics. These are all $5 billion plus companies that add to the benefit of Taiwan's economy. Year by year, these companies widen the margin between Taiwan and China, making Taiwan an unstoppable force not only in the region, but in the world. Pound for pound, Taiwan's already richer than China. An easy metric that brings us to this conclusion is GDP per capita, a universal measurement. GDP per capita is a popular metric for the average prosperity and well-being of a country. Unlike some other measures of economic productivity, it takes population size into account, allowing easy comparisons between countries with different sizes. That is why, when we take into consideration economy sizes, GDPs, population sizes, and wealth distribution, per capita income is a more accurate measure of a nation's economic progress. You see, even if a nation may have a high GDP and large population, its residents may not necessarily have high standards of living. This is the case that we see in a lot of countries, including China itself. Using this, we we can very clearly and in an unbiased way state that Taiwan is far richer than China. In fact, as of 2022, China's GDP per capita was approximately $12,814. Taiwan's, on the other hand, was almost 3 times as much at $32,756. That makes Taiwan one of the richest Asian countries, far outpacing China so far as GDP per capita is concerned. Don't shoot the messenger, the numbers say so. However, with just GDP in consideration, China takes the cake. As Taiwan's economy grows and the country becomes richer, the more they become less reliant on China. Because of the diplomatic problems between Taiwan and China, Taiwan is slowly making its break from China and its markets. As Taiwan grows in economic strength to someday soon rival China, it is pretty much breaking any big brother, little brother bond. So what are these signs that China and Taiwan are starting to sever bonds? Call it a decoupling as you will. Well, according to Taiwan's Investment Commission, Taiwanese realized investment in China has plummeted from $9 billion in 2017 to just $1.7 billion in 2022. What this simply means is that China's investment in Taiwan has steadily reduced at the same time when other countries' investment in Taiwan has increased. China is now far eclipsed by nations like the US and Netherlands, who have built closer relations with the island nation. Using completed statistics from 2022, you can see that the officially recorded investment data shows that China accounted for 34% of Taiwanese firms' worldwide investment in 2022, followed by 31% of Southeast Asia and India, and 13% of the US and Europe. This is in sharp contrast to a decade ago, when China accounted for over 2/3 of Taiwan's global outward investment. Again, all this reiterates the simple point that Taiwan and China are not growing economically at a consistent rate as was done in the past. What could be causing this problem or situation? Well, according to Taiwan's official survey report in 2022, it was explained that the growing competition from local producers, rising labor costs, and difficulty in developing China's domestic market are the main obstacles for Taiwanese firms doing business in China. Of course, these factors do not exist in a vacuum, and in tandem with other external factors, they all come together to contribute to the decoupling between the two nations. The data also tells us that Taiwan's investors are paying less attention to China and thereby focusing inward. Looking at the 2018 to 2019 pre-pandemic data shows us that Taiwanese investment in China fell by over 50% in that period alone. The timing strongly indicates that changing US trade policies toward China played a significant role in the matter. If you don't remember, that period went something like this.
We'll take you straight to the White House, the President of the United States announcing new trade tariffs against
China. 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 China.
Trade tensions are flaring up between the U.S. and China.
Trump announcing plans to increase tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods.
I happen to think that tariffs for our country are very powerful. You know, we're the piggy bank that everybody steals from.
Just to recap, between July 2018 and May 2019, Washington delivered 4 rounds of higher tariffs on Chinese goods. This was because of the political dynamics that were taking place between the two administrations. In a bid to not get caught in the crossfire that threatened to hurt them with friendly fire, China-based Taiwanese firms, especially those in the information and communication technology industry, shifted some production and export capacity from China to Taiwan and other developing countries, notably Vietnam. Looking at data from the U.S. International Trade Administration shows us that American imports of computers and electronic products from Taiwan and Vietnam doubled from 2019 to 2022, whereas imports of the same products from China increased by only 10% during that period. Taiwanese firms also largely echoed President Trump's push to invest in the American manufacturing industry. In 2020, their investments in the US rose by 650% to $4.2 billion. The investments continued to grow, amounting to $11 billion in 2022, and making the US Taiwan's 3rd largest outward investment destination after China and Singapore, according to Taiwan's Investment Commission. So as we said before, as Taiwan decouples from China, it moves that much closer to its other allies and directs its efforts inward as well. This has been beneficial to Taiwan, making it much richer. The train of soiled US/China diplomatic relations has continued thematically, and Taiwan always stands as the first to benefit. Taiwan is so valued by its allies, particularly the US, that we have had incidents where US diplomats risk the wrath of China in the backing of Taiwan. Case in point, this.
The Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, is in Taiwan.
The most senior U.S. politician to visit Taiwan in 25 years, Nancy Pelosi has said America will never abandon the island during a trip that's been condemned as a major provocation by China.
China's accusing the U.S. of playing with fire.
The meeting China did not want to happen
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi defying Beijing's stern warnings.
A torrent of Chinese aircraft, missiles, and ships moved towards Taiwan as soon as House Speaker Nancy Pelosi left the island.
While certain things like the US sanctions on exporting advanced semiconductor chips and equipment to China were a bit of a blow to Taiwanese companies' exports, the island nation's Ministry of Finance has had some interesting news. The figures show that the growth rate of Taiwanese exports of electronic products, including semiconductor chips to China and Hong Kong, has decelerated from 24% in 2020 and 2021 to 11% in 2022. But the growth rates of Taiwan's exports of electronic products to Southeast Asia and India accelerated greatly by 21% and 72% respectively. Quite the compensatory leap. On top of its own direct influence, Taiwan's growth has also had an indirect influence on China's economy. Take this situation for example. Taiwan's export of semiconductor chips to India for the final assembly could grow further after Apple decided to shift iPhone production to India. Apple is a main contributor to Taiwan's exports of semiconductor chips to assembled devices in a third country, and India is expected to account for 50% of iPhone production by 2027, up from 5% at present. That will increase the market for Taiwan and make the country even richer and more solid. But this market is not being created out of thin air. It's being taken from somewhere. Where exactly? Well, China. China's exports will suffer from the loss of its global factory status, and they will suffer a lot. Chinese firms have a particularly strong reliance on importing Taiwanese semiconductor chips, and that'll make them vulnerable during the decoupling of the cross-strait production network. With China's domestic economy suffering from a stagnant real estate market and weak private consumption, dwindling exports will only add hail to the snowstorm. This reduction in economic activity at the same time that Taiwan is soaring shows the reason why day by day, Taiwan is claiming the wealth throne from China. It also seems that somehow, the decoupling from China isn't affecting Taiwan adversely, despite it doing the same to China. Taiwan's overall trade posted positive growth in 2022, while China's exports and imports declined by 10% and 8% respectively. One of the likely outcomes that have been thought to occur from this decoupling is the fact that China might want to retaliate against Taiwan. One of the ways they could likely do this is through the termination of the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement. This Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement is a free trade agreement between the governments of the People's Republic of China and Taiwan that aims to reduce tariffs and commercial barriers between the two sides, as well as improve cross-strait relations. However, Taiwan's merchandise exports to China, which benefited from the lower tariffs in ECFA, accounted for only 5% of Taiwan's total exports. As such, the impact of ending ECFA on Taiwan's economy might be restrained. That's a nice way of us saying it really wouldn't be as effective as hoped for. Another method of retaliation unique to China in this case is, well, war. You know we can't entirely conclude the Taiwan/China discussion without talking about, well, war. There is a small chance that China can just try to annex Taiwan, as it already claims that it's part of its territory. We went over this earlier, we're sure you remember. China's President Xi Jinping has even publicly stated that Taiwan should be under no illusion of independence. His exact words this year were, "We should actively oppose the external forces and secessionist activities of Taiwan independence. We should unswervingly advance the cause of national rejuvenation and reunification." As much as China hasn't launched an attack on Taiwan, it would be ignorant to ignore China's provocations for several reasons. China has long since been known to be unpredictable, and to assume President Xi Jinping's actions is a mistake. As Taiwan keeps growing in wealth and power, it's not unfathomable to think that China would want access to the famous semiconductor technology from its renegade province. However, if China invaded Taiwan and TSMC were destroyed, Beijing would face a situation in which it had no significant access to EUV technology, no ability to mass-produce leading-edge semiconductors, and crippling economic sanctions that would cut it off from much of the global economy. It would be a catastrophic situation on all sides. All that said, the actual risk of imminent Chinese military action against Taiwan remains low. Beijing always flexes military muscle when the highest-level US and Taiwanese officials meet face-to-face, as it did with Speaker Pelosi's visit and then Speaker McCarthy's visit to Taiwan. It is much more likely that this stance between Taiwan and China will keep taking place in the shadows, and in the meantime, Taiwan's wealth is only set to grow. Back to the question, why is Taiwan becoming richer at a faster pace than China? Well, at least when it comes to GDP per capita. A part of the reason is the fact that China is very corrupt, and that erodes national wealth and destabilizes economic structure. Taiwan is corrupt too, as is every country on Earth, But where the Corruption Perceptions Index for the public sector showed 32 points in Taiwan for 2022, China's rating is far worse. China's point score was 55 points. Just for clarity, how the Corruption Perceptions Index works is, the higher the figure, the worse the rate of corruption. So yes, China's rate of corruption is almost 172% worse than Taiwan's. Corruption has eroded China's economy, and it continues to drag the country behind. Don't just think of over-the-counter corruption either. We're talking about corruption that can impose economic damages both directly, such as in cases of tax evasion, money laundering, and other illicit activities, and indirectly by distorting market mechanisms, increasing the cost of business, and discouraging competition. For you to understand this thoroughly, realize that in a 2018 report, the United Nations suggested that corruption across the world costs at least $2.6 trillion, or 5% of the global GDP. The same report also noted that businesses pay more than $1 trillion in bribes every year. You don't need us to tell you how substantial those figures are. For China, one calculation from 2001 pegged the cost of corruption at 14.5% to 14.9% of China's GDP between 1999 and 2001. A more recent estimate from 2010 put the financial cost of corruption for China at 10% of its GDP. That means a tenth of China's annual money is lost in bribes. Yikes. It's no wonder that bribery imposes significant challenges for China. Official government figures show that of the officials arrested in 2018 for corruption, 17 people received bribes of at least $1.47 million, and 5 have taken bribes of $14.7 million or more. In one instance, the vice chairman of the Hebei People's Congress, Yang Chongyong, was found guilty of accepting bribes totaling roughly $30 million in September 2018 and sentenced to life in prison. The corruption and bribery don't just happen at the top level only. No, it's across the board. Bribes have also been shown to find their way into the hands of tax collectors, which has made eliminating tax evasion a challenge for Beijing. According to the World Institute for Development Economics Research, tax evasion costs China $66.8 billion annually. To help root out evaders, China implemented the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Common Reporting Standard that provides Beijing with information on assets stored overseas. It's a good measure, but it's not quite as effective. There's more though. China has also begun targeting the entertainment industry, where fake contracts have been used to evade taxes. In a recent high-profile case, Chinese actress Fan Bingbing and her companies received fines of $127 million in back taxes and penalties. All this is not something that goes unnoticed either. Chinese citizens have consistently ranked corruption among their top concerns in various surveys. The 2013 China General Social Survey, for instance, stated that over 71% of respondents felt corruption was extremely serious or very serious. A 2016 Pew Research Center survey noted that 49% of respondents reported that corrupt officials are a very big problem, significantly higher than other concerns, such as the country's wealth gap and crime. Results from earlier Pew studies show that this concern is persistent, with 50% of respondents in 2012 reporting that corruption is a very big problem. Of course, this is not to say that once you eliminate corruption, China's economy will boom exponentially. No. No one factor can exist in a vacuum, but it is important to note that when you compare the reasons Taiwan is progressing more, and less corruption on the island is a contributing factor. So, at the end of the day, where are we with this? Well, for starters, China's meteoric rise that has seen it become this rich is very similar to the Taiwan miracle that occurred more than 4 decades ago. In actuality, those two events that have produced two giants share numerous characteristics. What China has now, factors like the availability of cheap labor among its population, political goodwill from a stable government, and the non-existence of trade unions, mirror factors that were behind the Taiwan miracle of the late 20th century. As much as Taiwan is wealthy and is still rising, it's hard to see that Taiwan as a nation is richer than China, or that its economy is more powerful. No. China's economy is simply too large for comparison. Today, China's share of global GDP stands at over 18% when adjusted for price differences, the largest of any country. In a way, the rise of China has overshadowed the economic growth of Taiwan, which, like many countries, cannot compete against China in labor-intensive industries due to the diminishing availability of a cheap, educated labor market in Taiwan. Taiwan, however, has found a solution, one created by finding its own niche, information technology. Taiwan, as we have been mentioning, has been investing into this sector heavily. As a result, Taiwan has become a major IT hub in the region, with the presence of Taiwanese technology being felt as far as an American Silicon Valley. In time, Taiwan could rise to the level of China, That time, however, is not now. The chances are there though, but some things need to be done for Taiwan's success story to be complete. For starters, Taiwan must continue to increase its margin in the semiconductor industry to solidify its position in the global economy. On top of this, Taiwan must diversify its economy so that it has a lot of sectors that are thriving, and so that the economy cannot be drastically shaken by inconsistencies in any one sector. With the aid of trade partners like the US, Taiwan can grow beyond reason and limitations. Taiwan must also become more fully integrated into the international community, including joining the WHO to prepare for the next pandemic and becoming part of the comprehensive and progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership to prepare for changes in the global supply chain. Taiwan's path towards a sustainable economic future depends not only on a capable government, a hardworking population, and a more global outlook, but also on the support of the international community. Taiwan cannot resist the gravitational pull of the Chinese economy unless like-minded democracies, which may all eventually face their own versions of Taiwan's China dilemma. As for how Taiwan will continue to develop relative to China, who knows? We suppose, as with all things, time will tell.
You are a chicken. Yes, you. You look around and sometimes wonder why your owner takes such good care of you. At first, you're not sure. You're skeptical. What if he sends you to the slaughterhouse? You've never been there, but you know very well none of your friends have ever come out of that place. You remain on high alert for when that fateful day might arrive. But it never does. Days go by, and then weeks, months, even years. You are now convinced your owner loves you more than any of these other chickens, and he would never do anything bad to you. Each passing day is additional evidence to say that you will live for the next. 1,000 days go by like this. 1,000 beautiful days. Until, of course, the 1,001st day, when the illusion of safety breaks, and you end up on someone's dinner plate. You should have never crossed the road. Now imagine how betrayed the chicken must have felt when it was being taken to that terrifying part of the farm. Given the 1,000 days worth of evidence, the chicken's trust in its owner was ironically at its highest level when it was eventually slaughtered. Perhaps, if it wasn't so foolish to believe that it was special or unique, maybe it would have at least been spared the feelings of betrayal. That one final day completely changed the outlook of the chicken's life. That one piece of evidence outweighed the previous 1,000 days. And it's not even a contest. This is something known as a black swan. A single event or observation that comes as a surprise with disproportionate consequences, radically changing our outlook about something. People used to think that swans could only be white, until they saw a black swan, which basically reshaped the way people thought about what is out there. Nassim Nicholas Taleb wrote a book called The Black Swan, The Impact of the Highly Improbable, to study this very phenomenon and shine light on how vulnerable we are to black swans, and how we are only becoming increasingly more vulnerable with each passing day. In his book, he talks about some fundamentals of epistemology that limit our ability to understand the black swans before they happen. But first, let's talk about why our modern society, as technologically advanced as it is the perfect nesting place for a black swan event. Let's say we're going to weigh a few thousand people, and at the extreme end of that sample contains the heaviest person in the world. So long as that person is subject to biological constraints like the rest of us, it doesn't really matter how much he or she weighs. Let's say 2,000 pounds. Now, how much do you think that accounts for in the total weight of all the people we weighed? The answer is probably less than 0.5%. It shows that even a crazy outlier like a 2,000 pound person doesn't really overwhelm the average. Taleb calls this ecosystem mediocristan, to refer to how the mediocre measurements of the average person do mostly represent all measurements quite well. Now, let's conduct the same experiment, but with wealth. Let's gather a few people and include just one of the 3,000 or so billionaires in that list. How much do you think that billionaire accounts for in the total wealth of all the people in that sample? An overwhelming majority, almost always close to 99%. Contrary to the first scenario, here the outlier overwhelms everything else. Taleb calls this world extremistan, as it rewards a few people extremely well, but leaves basically nothing for the others. Taleb says that the modern world is composed of circumstances that are geared towards extremistan, not mediocristan, because money, for all intents and purposes, is just a number in someone's book. The vast majority of money is completely digital. It's not subject to physics laws or biology to constrain it to minimal variance. Sure, most people don't make that much money, but a few people can make a lot of money. Similarly, if you want to consider musicians, most musicians don't sell that many albums, but a few artists sell quite a few. You can conduct the same thought experiment with book sales, scientific publications, shoe brands, and so on. Point is, the modern economy is very much a winner-take-all system that rewards a very small number of people with a disproportionately large portion of the pie. If it was more like the weight example we just talked about, you wouldn't expect the outliers to be so wild. But the fact that they really are indeed so wild just goes to show how unpredictable the environment we're living in really is. The forecasts we take for granted today often fail to take into account the true nature of this unpredictability, these black swan events. You might be inclined to say that, no, these billionaires put in the work day in and day out, and therefore they can enjoy the fruits of their labor. Indeed, most of them probably worked really hard. Some of their innovations might later pave the way for a better future for all of us. I'm not discounting that. However, the system is not rewarding them proportionately. More importantly, it's hard to say how much of their efforts are the fruits of their labor and how much of it is due to pure chance. If you were to run a few simulations with extremist-type circumstances, you would inevitably have a few Jeff Bezos-like outliers. We may be biased into thinking that we understand what causes Bezos-like outliers in our society. You know, the usual. Think out of the box, start a revolutionary company, work extremely hard for a few years, and then smell the roses. Happily ever after. We've all read the autobiographies. We've all watched the documentaries. However, when was the last time you read about a person who did all of those things and failed? When was the last time you saw shelves of books about people who failed? Chances are, probably never. These stories just never really quite make it. There is an epistemic bias in all of this. Taleb says, now take a look at the cemetery. It is quite difficult to do so, because people who fail don't seem to write memoirs, and if they did, those business publishers I know would not even consider giving them the courtesy of a returned phone call. This is despite the fact that, often, advice about what not to do is more useful than what to do. But that's just the economy. That's just one facet of society. We also don't understand the socio-political aspects. Take 9/11 for example, which is certainly a black swan event. After it happened, you had tons of experts come out and say that they had known for years that it was about to happen. Well, why didn't they say anything? This retrospective distortion of the understanding of a problem is one of the hallmarks of a black swan event. None of them really knew. If they did, cockpit doors would have been bulletproof long ago, pocket knives would have never been allowed into cabins, and the TSA would have been invented much earlier. But these things were only instituted after 9/11. If you were to suggest such policies in 1991, for example, you would probably not be taken too seriously, or would have been shown a spreadsheet that suggested airlines don't have the money for bulletproof doors. But inevitably, they did. Thankfully, the likelihood of a 9/11 style event is much lower now than it used to be. Countries around the world are more prepared, more vigilant. However, that also makes these precautions somewhat lose their relevance. Yuval Noah Harari, in his book Homo Deus, cites a paradox about knowledge. He says, knowledge that does not change behavior is useless, but knowledge that changes behavior loses its relevance. The more data we have and the better we understand history, the faster history alters its course, and the faster our knowledge becomes outdated. Despite the measures we have taken for a black swan event like 9/11, that does nothing to improve our odds against a future black swan. If anything, it might lure us into a false sense of security, and in fact worsen our chances of coping with the impacts of the next highly improbable event. We tend to convince ourselves that we understand risks once we have understood a game of dice or blackjack. However, trying to approximate the risks in real life with the same methods used in a closed-loop artificial game is simply oversimplification, a mistake that we commit daily. This, Taleb calls, is the ludic fallacy. We learn simple games and immediately conclude that the stock market works in the same way, even though one of these things lives in mediocristan and the other lives in extremistan. If the markets were well understood, do you think something like GameStop or AMC would have ever been allowed to happen? Sure, short squeezing is not a particularly new phenomenon, and yet, even a non-black swan event such as this one left even the smartest hedge fund managers scratching their heads and practically chasing bankruptcy. This false sense of understanding makes black swans that much more dangerous. There are other reasons why we are increasingly more vulnerable to black swans. Taleb said whereas in the past people might have been studying different kinds of literature and diving deep into a locally developed set of ideas, today, arguably the most read book is Harry Potter. That's of course not to say Harry Potter is a bad book or anything, but it goes to show that we are much less in tune with each other's ideas, for better or for worse. For the most part, everyone is dealing with generally the same ideas. That coupled with the rising complexity and reach of technology means when something fails, it fails for more people than ever before. The Pakistani government tried to shut down YouTube in Pakistan. It ended up shutting down YouTube worldwide, Taleb cited. We don't understand these things. That's just one way for technology to fail. But it goes to show how interconnected things are. And while that is often touted as a plus, given sufficiently poor luck, that can really spell doom for us all. Take coronal mass ejections as an example. These are regular bursts of radiation from the sun that scientists on Earth know and expect. The largest coronal mass ejection ever on record is the Carrington event in 1859. Its effects were mostly felt by telegraph operators who had some of their equipment burnt from the sudden surge. Most of the world went on without a hitch. On the other hand, if a Carrington-class event were to occur today, with all the grids, electric cars, and equipment that we now have, the damages would be in the trillions of dollars, and repair could take decades if at all possible. And with each passing day, with each little transition into an electric future, we're becoming more and more vulnerable to such an event. The thing is, this isn't even a black swan event. In 2012, the likelihood of a Carrington event in the next decade was calculated to be around 12%. And yet, despite that high probability, we're not particularly prepared for such an event. Given the esoteric nature of its risk, seemingly low probability but high impact, despite all the mounting evidence, you'll have a very hard time convincing governments to make modifications to power grids to avoid catastrophic failures. So if that's how little we care about an event that we know is bound to occur eventually, imagine how unaware we are of a true black swan. The chicken in the farm, were it to somehow be spared by some miracle, would never trust another human being ever after the betrayal it endured. However, few are ever so lucky. Meanwhile, for the owner, the chicken's death comes as no surprise. It is a routine event, and therefore no black swan. The idea of a black swan is therefore relative to the knowledge one possesses. Hence, our objective is to try and be in the position of the butcher, not the butchered. Taleb says, I worry less about advertised and sensational risks, more about the vicious, hidden ones. Of course, the idea of a black swan also incorporates good things, such as wildly unlikely positive outcomes of chance, otherwise known as life. The odds of being born are 1 in 400 trillion. But to be fair, I just unfollowed my own advice. Such a thing can't really be predicted, can it? For all we know, and for all we don't, being born is an unimaginably unlikely event that nobody really predicted. So if you are alive, whatever that means, in the end, we're actually all the black swans we've been trying to avoid the entire time. Ironic, isn't it?
In the year 1925, Einstein shared with a student his burning desire to understand the universe. I want to know how God created this world, he said as they strolled along. I'm not interested in this or that phenomenon, in the spectrum of this or that element. I want to know his thoughts. The rest are just details. This one conversation expresses the core of Einstein's guiding principle, one that has driven humanity to inquire, discover, experiment, and most importantly, learn about this universe we call home. But what was Einstein really talking about? And can human knowledge ever reach a point where we understand everything? Since the discovery of the world of quantum mechanics in the early 20th century, scientists have been racking their brain trying to understand how it works. Even a century later, we're still not sure how and why subatomic particles behave the way they do. But that's just half the problem. The discovery of quantum theory posed a more serious issue that Einstein, Stephen Hawking, and other world-renowned physicists have been working tirelessly to solve. That challenge can be summarized in one word: unification. You see, modern physics is split into two pillars: classical physics, the physics of Newton, Einstein, and Galileo, which predicts gravity and describes the motion of massive things in our cosmos like stars and planets, and quantum physics, which governs the world of subatomic particles according to its own set of laws and rules. Both pillars describe their respective worlds accurately, but fail when applied to each other's subject matter. Einstein's preoccupation was that there must be a way that these two worlds could reconcile. There has to be a theory that unifies the world of the subatomic with the world of the massive. A theory that can predict, well, everything. Now you might be thinking, so why should we care? Well, a unified theory that can bridge both of these worlds could potentially unlock many of our universe's secrets and answer some of the deepest philosophical and theological questions that we've been asking since the days of Galileo. What are we truly made of? What happened before the Big Bang? Are we living in a multiverse? The unified theory, or the theory of everything, might just have the answers to all of these questions. The universe and everything in it is glued together by 4 fundamental forces. I made an entire video on these 4 forces, so if you really want to fully understand all of them, I suggest you check it out. But for the sake of this video, here is the gist of what they do. Big objects like stars, planets, humans, and cats are all governed by the force of gravity. And thanks to Einstein and his general theory of relativity, we now know that gravity isn't a force that magically pulls objects together. Instead, it's the curving and warping of the fabric of our universe, space-time. While all these big objects are governed by just one fundamental force, subatomic particles, on the other hand, are governed by 3 fundamental forces, as if they weren't already confusing enough. These 3 fundamental forces are electromagnetic, weak nuclear, and strong nuclear. Electromagnetism holds atoms together, the strong force holds nuclei together, and the weak force is responsible for some type of nuclear decay. These particles, along with their respective forces, make up what we call the Standard Model. The Standard Model describes the world of the very small. We know that everything in the universe is made of subatomic particles, from planets and stars to humans and dogs. We know that all of these things are made of atoms, and atoms are made of protons, neutrons, and electrons. In the 1960s, we discovered that even protons and neutrons are made of even smaller particles called quarks, and electrons from leptons. Using different combinations of these particles and their respective forces, we can build atoms, molecules, humans, planets, and even stars. So it seems that the Standard Model is a comprehensive interpretation of our universe. But it doesn't include everything. The truth is, finding the smallest subatomic particles is only the first step to getting to a theory of everything. The second step would be finding a place for gravity in this model. There are 2 reasons why gravity isn't included. The first is that when it comes to small particles, the force of gravity is so weak that it doesn't have any effect on a quantum system. The second reason is that we don't really know how to incorporate general relativity, which describes the motion of large objects, into the world of quantum that governs subatomic particles. Many great minds, including Einstein, tried tirelessly. It's said that even on his deathbed, Einstein revisited his notes on the theory of everything and tried one last time to find an elegant solution to explain the fundamental differences between the world of the small and that of the large. But unfortunately, he ran out of time. So that's that, right? While we still haven't found a theory that can explain everything, we have made significant progress, and maybe the most groundbreaking was that of another brilliant mind, Stephen Hawking. In 2014, a movie was made on the impactful life of Stephen Hawking. As a result, Hawking became one of the most revered physicists in the world, and one of the most admired by pop culture. Away from the limelight, however, Hawking, like Einstein, had an obsessive yearning to understand the universe and never ceased to challenge our knowledge of it. One of his greatest contributions was the discovery of what is now known as Hawking radiation. In 1974, Hawking discovered one of the biggest breakthroughs of the 20th century, a groundbreaking interpretation of black holes, as well as an unprecedented interaction between the world of quantum and gravity. Hawking's discovery was so ingenious that it gave us hope that the theory of everything, the holy grail of physics, is still a human possibility. Black holes are densely packed regions of space where the gravitational pull is so strong that nothing can escape, not even light.
Einstein predicted the presence of black holes through his general theory of relativity in 1916, and we confirmed his predictions in 1974 when we observed our first black hole in the Milky Way. In the same year, Hawking discovered that black holes are like a vitamin tablet placed in water. They can dissipate in time and release energy. This is what we know as Hawking radiation today. But how can energy escape a black hole when nothing else can? Hawking used a quantum understanding to explain this. When we think of space, we imagine large, cold, empty places, but in reality, space is alive with the active creation and destruction of energy at the subatomic stage. Particles are created in pairs, matter and antimatter, and they are constantly created and destroyed in a concept known as annihilation. Hawking imagined a pair of particles created very close to the event horizon of a black hole. This is the boundary around a black hole from which nothing can escape. He then showed that these particles don't need to annihilate each other, since one of them can be sucked into the black hole. If the black hole is receiving negative energy, then it has to release energy in order for the law of conservation of energy to hold. Hawking also proved that black holes lose mass with time, and they don't last forever. But more importantly, he was able to arrive at this discovery by merging a quantum principle with the concept of gravity. This is by far the closest we've come to a theory of everything, a unified field theory, or quantum gravity. But as with most things in science, the fact that we haven't found that one elegant equation does not mean that we have failed. In fact, maybe the real treasure was the discoveries we made along the way, many of which have paved the way for a brighter future for humankind. String theory is one of the most prominent ones. It suggests that subatomic particles such as electrons and quarks are made of tiny vibrating strings or filaments that twist and fold, creating everything in our universe. Just like the strings of a violin, they can vibrate in various patterns, creating different kinds of particles, including the graviton, a hypothetical particle that, according to quantum mechanics, should carry the force of gravity. On paper, string theory could unite gravity and quantum mechanics under one framework once and for all. The theory was popularized in the 60s and 70s, and its mathematics predicts small bundled up extra dimensions that give rise to a network of universes, or a multiverse. While this theory is prominent, it's highly untestable, even with access to the latest technology. String theory, though, is only the beginning. After almost 2 decades of tireless research, we've discovered the Higgs boson. This proved that electrons and quarks inside the atom get their mass from an invisible field that spreads throughout space. The discovery took an effort from a group of 3,000 scientists that dedicated endless hours to the cause that would surely bring our species one step closer to understanding our universe. We've also discovered that all the atoms and light in the universe only make up less than 5% of the total content of the cosmos. The remaining 95% is composed of dark matter and dark energy, which are invisible, but whose effects dominate the evolution of our universe. Dark matter provides the gravitational pull that keeps galaxies together, while dark energy is responsible for the ever-accelerating expansion of our universe. For thousands of years, we've looked to the heavens and wondered what mysteries are hiding beyond the clouds. Since 1970, there have been more than 90 telescopes placed in orbit by NASA and the ESA to bring the universe closer to us. And with the James Webb Telescope that launched on December 25, 2021, we entered a new era of discovery. This telescope is the largest and most powerful one ever built, and its daunting task is to find the first galaxies that formed in the early universe, and peer through dusty clouds to see stars forming planetary systems. We may not have found the theory that unites quantum with gravity yet, but every discovery brings us one step closer to that ultimate goal of unification. Throughout our time on this planet, we've pushed the boundaries of existence by asking tough questions and working tirelessly to find the answers. Our species has been defined by its incessant thirst for knowledge and unwavering hope in a unified universe. 350 years have elapsed since our first big successful step in this journey, when Newton unified the heavens with the earth, revealing that planets, stars, and apples are guided by the same set of laws. 200 years later, James Clerk Maxwell coupled electricity with magnetism, and then Einstein linked space and time and warped them into one fabric that we now know as space-time. Looking at the timeline of these events, it shouldn't be surprising that the road ahead could be much longer. Einstein died dreaming of a physical world governed by one set of laws, a unified framework that can unlock the mysteries of our universe, and Hawking never ceased to look up at the stars and wonder what mysteries lie ahead waiting to be found. Whether the theory of everything is a realistic quest or a delusional attempt to make sense of the absurdity of the universe, one thing is certain. Our unwavering hope in the search for unification will only lead to humanity's advancement as a species. If you feel you're in a black hole, don't give up. There's a way out. If a tree falls down in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? How do you know? Taking it one step further, if you hear the tree hit the ground but don't see it, why do you trust your sense of hearing? This might seem like a ridiculous question, but the truth is that despite our total reliance on them, our senses deceive us all the time. You hear this audio and some of us hear Yanny while the others hear Laurel. You think you hear your friend laughing in the other room, only to come out and see it's just the TV. A stick that looks bent in the water turns out to be straight when you pull it out. You spend what seems like hours walking through a dark and creepy forest, but then wake up and realize you were just dreaming. The world is a strange place, and for all the knowledge we've managed to gather as a species, there's still a lot more that we don't. Here is everything we don't know, too. I think, therefore I am. You've likely heard this phrase before. Coined by 17th century French philosopher René Descartes, the simple declaration serves as the foundation of all modern philosophy. It's a statement of knowledge, an assertion that if I know nothing else, I at least know I exist. While this may not seem like a revolutionary idea at first glance, it's actually quite significant. Philosophers since the time of Socrates have wondered whether or not it's possible to know anything, because it always seems that the more questions we ask, the fewer answers we're left with. Descartes himself was renowned for his astonishing ability to doubt everything, no matter how trivial, no matter how seemingly obvious. He treated all of his ideas with a radical level of skepticism, believing that doing so would eventually lead him to the truth. This skepticism led him to ask a question that science still hasn't been able to answer. How do I know I'm not dreaming right now? Or, even more frightening, how do I know that my mind isn't being deliberately misled by some evil genius? Think of it like the movie The Matrix. It's possible that, at this very moment, you're hooked up to a giant machine that is feeding you all the sensory data you're currently experiencing. You aren't really watching this video, it's just the machine making you think that you are. While unlikely, technically it is possible, and there's no way we can disprove it. This is why some people argue that we live in a simulation. Do we or don't we? We just don't know. Descartes argues that our inability to rule out this scenario forces us to doubt everything we think we know, a state of radical skepticism in which we can't trust anything we experience or think. Fortunately, Descartes offers us a way out. Even if we are forced to doubt everything, the one thing we cannot doubt is the fact that we're doubting. If we can doubt, then we can think, and if we can think, then there must be a mind doing the thinking. So while we may never know whether or not the world around us is an illusion, or if we even have physical bodies, we can rest easy in the knowledge that we have minds, that we exist, right? Well, not so much. Later philosophers from Kierkegaard to Heidegger criticized Descartes' claim, arguing that the existence of thoughts does not necessarily imply the existence of a thinker. Friedrich Nietzsche even went so far as to say that the idea that there is something called thinking is itself an assumption. All we can really say then is that something is happening. What that thing is, we just don't know. If you're rolling your eyes at this point, it's understandable. To most people, this all sounds like a bunch of over-intellectualized nonsense with no bearing on the actual world. Even if we do live in the Matrix, I still know that 2 + 2 = 4, that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, and that the earth beneath my feet is solid. Well, hold up on the last point. Part of the reason why it's so difficult to say whether we truly know anything is because we live in a dynamic universe where nothing is ever stable. Everything in existence is always moving and always changing, including the Earth itself. Even as you watch this video, the very face of the planet is evolving. Plate tectonic theory is a relative newcomer to science. First pioneered in the 1960s, our understanding of how the Earth shifts and moves is still fairly limited. We've discovered certain things, like the fact that the Earth's rocky crust is in the form of plates that sits on top of a mantle of liquid magma.
As this magma circulates and churns, it pushes the plates around, knocking them into each other and creating earthquakes, volcanoes, and mountains. What this means is that, contrary to what we think, the ground beneath our feet isn't solid. It's constantly changing, and if it is, how can we say we know it? Tomorrow, an earthquake could reshape our continents, and so the best we can ever have is a rough approximation of what we think it used to be, not what it actually is. Maybe I'm just trying to strong-arm a metaphor here, but it seems like whenever we investigate what we think we know, our ideas start to crumble. It's an interesting quirk of reality, really. The simpler a question is, the harder it can be to answer. It's for this reason that many people fear death, because we simply don't know anything about what happens after it. Yet I cannot help but think that the fear that we don't know anything about death presupposes that we know what life is, because in reality, we don't know either. While it's easy for us to tell the difference between living and non-living materials, say like an apple versus a rock, but when we try to pin down a precise definition of life, things get complicated. All life forms, whether a plant or animal, bacteria or fungus, are composed of cells and are able to meet certain basic fundamental conditions. These include responsiveness, metabolism, energy transformation, growth, and reproduction. For instance, when you smell food, you respond by feeling hungry. Eating a sandwich then starts your metabolic process, which allows you to convert calories into energy. This energy is then used to do things like grow muscles or attract a mate. But this is what life does, not what life is. The main problem is that the primary feature of life is that it's always changing, and definitions by their nature are meant to be static. Perhaps if we knew where life came from, we'd have a better sense of what exactly it is. Unfortunately, we don't know this either. Of course, one day science will figure this stuff out. The secrets to life, the earth, and everything else will be unlocked. All it takes is more advanced technology, more sophisticated methods, and we'll be able to know the answers for certain, won't we? Here's the thing though, science isn't ever 100% certain. When researchers at the European Organization for Nuclear Research, otherwise known as CERN, announced the discovery of the Higgs boson in 2012, they did so by stating that their observations had passed the crucial threshold of 5 sigma certainty. To most people, this term is nothing more than academic jargon, but sigma in this context is the statistical unit of measurement used to determine how probable it is that a given result is correct. The higher the value, the more likely a particular finding is true, with 5 sigma being the gold standard, representing a 1 in a million chance that a given observation is inaccurate. Though, there's still a chance. You may think I'm splitting hairs here. After all, 1 in a million is as good as true, isn't it? Well, no. A 2011 experiment conducted by CERN reportedly found that a series of nearly massless ghost particles, called neutrinos, had traveled faster than the speed of light. This was, of course, impossible, as the finding violated Einstein's principle of relativity, yet the experiment passed with a 6 sigma confidence, meaning that it had a staggering 1.5 billion chance of being false. And yet it was. 4 later experiments all failed to replicate the original results, and the first experiment was written up as a fluke. Science is very good at explaining what is happening and how it happens, but not really why it's happening. Pass any scientific revelation through a series of why questions, and you'll always get to a point where we just don't know. Take gravity, for instance. When an apple falls from a tree and hits Isaac Newton on his head, we know it's gravity. We can even measure it as 9.8 meters per second. But when it comes to explaining why this happens, almost 350 years later, we're still clueless. Every other physical force in the universe, electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear force, has a corresponding subatomic particle. Yet we still don't know what the particle responsible for gravity is. Physicists have theorized the existence of something called a graviton that, similar to the Higgs boson, requires massive amounts of energy to detect. In fact, it's predicted that it would take a mass spectrometer the size of Jupiter, operating at 100% capacity, to identify one. But why is a graviton so hard to find? Why is it that physics behaves like this, and is it possible that it could work differently? The notion of alternate physics is most commonly associated with the multiverse theory, the idea that there isn't a single universe but an infinite array of different universes. We don't know if this is true, of course, but if it is, then it's possible that among these countless variations, there exists other types of physics. Maybe in another universe, gravity isn't so difficult to measure. Maybe instead, electromagnetism is the rogue force confounding their scientists. But it isn't just other universes that may operate under alternative sets of physical laws. Even our own universe may be subject to alternate forms of physics that we've yet to discover. In 2022, researchers at Columbia University programmed an AI to study video footage of different physical phenomena and then search for the minimal set of variables that described its observations. The footage included things like a pendulum, a lava lamp, and a fireplace. When the AI returned its results, the researchers found that they could identify some of the variables that the artificial intelligence had defined, but not others. The belief is that the AI was applying novel sets of physical laws currently unknown to humans. Unfortunately, since the program can't communicate what it's thinking, the exact variables remain a mystery. However, it does raise an interesting question. If we were to meet an alien species, is it possible that they might use alternate laws of physics? Ted Chiang's novella, Story of Your Life, the inspiration for the 2016 film Arrival, explores this idea. Fair warning, there's spoilers ahead. In the story, humans make first contact with aliens after dozens of spaceships suddenly appear in orbit, but rather than wanting to take over the planet, it seems that the extraterrestrial visitors just want to talk. To get the conversation going, both humans and the aliens work together to slowly decipher one another's language, as well as their respective approaches to physics. It quickly becomes apparent that the scientific and mathematical concepts that are advanced to us, like calculus, are elementary to them. Surprisingly though, the reverse is also true. The aliens deploy strange, seemingly convoluted methods to describe basic principles like velocity. While both methods provide accurate results, each is highly specific to the species that developed them. Eventually, it's explained that the aliens don't perceive our universe as causal. Instead, they witness all events as happening simultaneously. This accounts for their weird set of physics. Chiang's Story of Your Life raises interesting questions surrounding concepts like time, perception, free will, and subjectivity, forcing its readers to wonder if there's such a thing as objective reality. How do we know that the reality we experience is independent of our own consciousness? This problem has plagued philosophers since antiquity. Plato, in particular, is known for having proposed the idea of the realm of forms, a non-physical, immaterial plane from which the physical world manifests. Science actually functions on a similar principle, assuming that there is an objective reality that exists beyond our senses, which can be observed and measured. Despite our best efforts, though, no one has ever confirmed the existence of an objective reality. In fact, given that everything we know has to come first to us through our senses and therefore our own subjective perception, it's impossible to prove an objective reality. We'll just never know. In his book, The Spell of the Sensuous, philosopher David Abram argues that the very idea of an objective reality isn't representative of the universe we live in. In actuality, Abram says we exist in the realm of inner subjectivity, a term he borrows from the German philosopher Edmund Husserl. This form of reality, rather than being a separate and isolated phenomenon, is created by the collective experience of all its participants. The universe doesn't exist as an object of our subjective perceptions. Instead, it arises out of our very interaction with it. If this idea sounds a little out there, consider quantum mechanics, where our mere observations literally affect the state of matter. Just by measuring a photon of light, we're able to change it from a wave to a particle. So maybe there's no such thing as objective reality. Maybe all that exists is our collective intersubjective experience. There's simply no way of knowing. Plunging into the depths of uncertainty is never pleasant. That's why humans came up with reason and science in the first place. We want to feel as though we know things. It gives us a sense of control in an otherwise chaotic, unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous universe. For the majority of my life, I was agnostic about most things. If there wasn't what I deemed to be rational, scientific proof to support an idea, I just didn't believe it. But the more I learn, the more I realize how limited my own experience is, and just how much we as a species don't know. Ordinary matter accounts for just 5% of the entire universe. The rest of it, 95% of everything that exists, is a complete and total mystery. We just don't know. It seems naive, if not outright arrogant, to close myself off to new ideas just because they don't fit within my current understanding of how things work. Tomorrow, the Earth could shift, life as we know it could completely change, and everything that science has taught us could turn out to just be a fluke. But rather than meeting this dilemma with fear or outright rejection of scientific principles, we should take it as an opportunity to learn, embracing uncertainty as a means of transforming our perception. To me, this seems like the only rational path forward. Because as it turns out, everything we don't know is, well, everything. We've all experienced it. You're sitting around at the table for a family dinner. Across the table from you is that cousin you haven't seen since the last family get-together. In the most confident fashion, he opens his mouth and starts talking passionately on a subject he clearly knows very little about. You look down at your phone, and in one quick Google search, you find out everything he's saying is completely wrong. But he doesn't seem to know it. Everyone else at the table doesn't seem to know it either. His confidence is so strong and unwavering that you start to wonder, does this guy know how wrong he really is? This is the Dunning-Kruger effect. People who know very little about a subject tend to overestimate how much they know because they just don't know how much they don't know. As a result, the people who are most confident in their ability are not usually the ones who should be. The term Dunning-Kruger is named after the two scientists who first discovered this psychological phenomenon, David Dunning and Justin Kruger. In 1999, they carried out research titled Unskilled and Unaware of It, where they tested a group of people on grammar, humor, and logic. In the first experiment, the 65 participants were asked to rate jokes they thought people would find funny. The people who personally felt they were excellent judges of humor were the ones who did the worst on the test. Dunning and Kruger then put the same participants through varying degrees of grammar and logic tests, and the results always came out the same. For the most part, the people who scored the least were the most confident going into the test, and overestimated how well they did afterwards, while those who scored the most overestimated how well everyone else did. Now you might think, how does this really happen? Surely you should just know when you fail a test, right? You have that gut feeling, and after all, you're the one who wrote it yourself. But that only happens when you know nothing about the subject at all. When we learn just a little bit about that subject, we start overestimating how much we actually know. We are aware that we know about the subject, however, we don't know enough to know that there is still so much more to learn. We are not yet skilled enough to accurately assess our knowledge and abilities, so we think we know much more than we actually do. Imagine you're given a test about the culture of extraterrestrial life. You just watched a 30-minute YouTube documentary and you're feeling pretty good about your knowledge of things that haven't been proven to exist. But apart from this documentary, you haven't done any other research about extraterrestrial life. You haven't been to space, and you certainly don't have any alien friends. You're handed the test, and in it, you're asked to answer 20 questions about life as an extraterrestrial. I know what you're thinking. You're not entirely ignorant. You just watched a 30-minute documentary about aliens, so you'll certainly ace this test, or at least do better than the average. Right? Well, that is the Dunning-Kruger effect at work, because the truth is, just one documentary is not nearly enough. You've only just discovered the tip of the iceberg, but because you don't know how big the ice under the water is, you'll keep living in the illusion that you've explored all of it. And we see this every day. From your cousin sitting across the room to that one coworker that gets really annoyed when someone else gets the promotion they feel they so desperately deserve. Performance reports at work give us an unbiased view on how well we've done. However, when people who truly don't know all that much get these results, they aren't satisfied with it. Because in their minds, they've done a lot better than what the report says, so they make up excuses like, the boss didn't like me, or look down on the coworker that got the promotion over them, not stopping for once to think that maybe they still have a lot to learn. All the engineers in a company were once asked to rate their work and determine how well they were doing compared to the rest of their colleagues. 42% of the engineers believed that they were among the top 5% in the company. In another scenario, professors were asked whether they did average, below average, or above average work. 94% of all the professors in the survey believed that they do above average work, a figure that defies mathematical plausibility. You would think that professors who are always grading people would be able to come up with a more accurate self-assessment. But the reality is, we are all victims of the Dunning-Kruger effect, both as professor and student.
Some scientists argue that the Dunning-Kruger effect might not be because of poor self-assessment, but rather just the poor performers wanting to paint a fluffed-up report of their performance. And while you can get where this argument is coming from, it doesn't make sense, because there are a lot of places where we observe the Dunning-Kruger effect even when there's no reason for the person to want to look good. The truth is, we can't give an accurate judgment of skills we know only very little about, because we simply don't know what is good and what is not. We haven't seen both ends of the spectrum. Metacognition is the awareness of your own thought processes. It's being able to plan, monitor, and access your own performance and understanding. It's like your brain's way of grading itself. In their research, Dunning and Kruger discovered that the less people know about a subject, the lesser their metacognitive ability around that subject. This is what makes them unaware of their own incompetence. And this is a very strange thing, because it means that oftentimes, the loudest person in the room is usually the one who knows the least. Bertrand Russell said this in 1951, and it still rings true today, even now more than ever. Because although he thought it was just a thing of his time,